Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. My channel isn't monetized, so if you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Chapters 271 through 280 of the previous episode. Chun Ping'an fiercely battles a tree spirit scholar, unleashing a relentless 20-punch barrage with his deity drumming technique. The scholar barely survives using a magical armor pellet. As the scholar's allies arrive to ambush him, Chun deploys his trump card. His two bonded flying swords. First strikes the armor, breaking its defense, allowing the faster 15th to instantly pierce the scholar's forehead and kill him. Terrified by the flying swords, the allies mistake Chun for a supreme sword immortal and flee. The novice martial artist is left utterly bewildered. Thank you. Now, let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. In the backyard of the estate, a fierce battle was taking place outside the boudoir. Xianxia had traveled all the way here with the intention of slaying demons, and even though he was only a 4th-tier martial artist, the saber he was wielding was a divine weapon of a very high caliber. After being injected with true qi, it would release a burst of red light that could slice through all things in its path with unstoppable force. As it turned out, the old woman outside was a 3rd-tier qi refiner, but she was already quite advanced in age and no longer had the energy to fight. After only around a dozen exchanges, she was knocked out cold by Xianxia using the pommel of his saber, then kicked into a nearby room, where she lay in an unconscious state. Under normal circumstances, the old woman wouldn't have put on such an inept display. However, the problem was that she had resided in this estate for over a century, and during that time, she had constantly been basking in the sinister energies drawn here by the formation. As a result, even though she wasn't a sinister ghostly being, she was still particularly weak to the yang energy imbued within the man's prized saber. On top of that, Xianxia had accumulated a great deal of experience in battle during his travels, and with those factors combined, it was no wonder that the old woman had been defeated so quickly. Following the old woman's defeat, the male owner of the estate had emerged to face Xianxia on his own. He drifted down into the yard from the reclining chair, wielding a long sword that hadn't seen the light of day for a long time. The blade of the sword was as cool as water, and against the opposing saber, the sword took a more delicate and sprightly approach, refraining from clashing directly against it. Every sword strike was aimed at the important acupoints all over Xianxia's body, and a burst of azure swordlight was being released from the tip of the sword, whizzing around like an agile firefly in the stormy night. In contrast, Xianxia fought in a very direct and confrontational fashion. His attacks were rather bland and lacking in embellishment, but every single saber strike of his was fast and powerful. He didn't use a vast array of techniques, nor were his attacks particularly refined, but they were fast and decisive, and they would be sure to severely wound the opponent upon contact. Hence, even though the black-robed man had superior technique, Xianxia still had the upper hand. As the battle wore on, Xianxia's attacks became even faster and more formidable, and it seemed that he was being fueled by a sense of righteous fury as he roared, "You deplorable bastard! You clearly came from a righteous path, so why have you willingly fallen into depravity rather than striving to pursue the great Tao? What do you have to show for your efforts? You're nothing more than a half-human, half-ghost abomination. You insist on protecting that female ghost at the expense of the welfare of this entire area. Look at what you've done. This entire place is completely devoid of human habitation for hundreds of kilometers. You deserve to die 1,000 deaths for your heinous crimes." With another furious roar, Xianxia gripped the hilt of his saber with both hands, then swung it down viciously upon his opponent's sword. The blow was so ferocious that the male owner of the estate was sent stumbling back several dozen feet, and it certainly wasn't helping his cause that his feet were slipping on the slick ground. After steadying himself with great difficulty, the black-robed man forced down a mouthful of blood that was threatening to gush out of his throat, then flicked his wrist to slash the air. As the sword struck the rain droplets in its path, they sounded like firecrackers. Xianxia took a step forward while holding his saber in one hand, and the saber was glowing with dazzling radiance, illuminating his entire arm as he pointed a finger directly at the black-robed man with a furious look on his face. The teachings of Buddhism say that it's never too late to turn back and mend one's ways. Lay down your sword right now and repent over what you've done. Do you really think I don't dare to cut you down? For the first time in the battle, the black-robed man spoke, and even though his voice was extremely raspy, resembling the sound of a blunt blade being sharpened on a whetstone, there was a refined and elegant disposition about him, and not only did he not hurl any spiteful words at his opponent, he jibed with a calm expression. The teachings of Buddhism also say that the one must first lay down their blade if they wish to attain salvation. Xianxia inspected his surroundings briefly, then took a glance at the reclining chair on the second floor before withdrawing his gaze as he sneered. The fact that you're still in the mood to be bickering with me tells me that there must be some more tricks up your sleeve that you're relying on. I suppose that should come as no surprise. Given your background and your cultivation base as a fifth-tier chi refiner, perhaps you've already accumulated a huge amount of filthy wealth over the past century. Otherwise, the nearby mountain god wouldn't be turning a blind eye to your actions. If I'm not mistaken, you must be too ashamed to go back to your seniors. But you've definitely been flaunting your background so that no one would dare to touch you. Isn't that right? Xianxia was becoming more and more furious as he spoke, and his face resembled that of the furious war deities being worshipped in temples as he roared. Answer me! The black-robed man remained silent with a faint smile on his face, but there was a hint of melancholy deep in his eyes. I gave you a chance to repent and change your ways, but you chose not to take it, so don't blame me for cutting you down in cold blood.
Xianxia.
The black-robed man heaved a faint sigh, and a slightly guilty look appeared on his face as he bit through the tip of his own index finger, using his own blood to inscribe runes upon the blade of his sword. Inscription talismans had always been an integral part of the Taoist teaching, and it was said that in ancient times, such inscriptions could be used to send messages directly to the deities in the heavens. If one's message were sufficiently earnest and reverent to be accepted by such deities, then all types of miracles would befall them. For example, an inscription talisman presented to lightning deities could grant one the ability to wield lightning with their bare hands. On top of that, they would attain a godly body, and for a short time, it would be as if they were a lightning god incarnate, wielding tremendous power. No wonder there are remnants of inscription talismans on that shadow wall over there. You're an official disciple of Divine Edict sect. How could someone like you have fallen so far? You're even more deplorable than I imagined. Xianxia was absolutely fuming, and he slashed down with all his might, unleashing an eruption of light that was so radiant that it was as if night had suddenly transitioned to day in the courtyard. No matter how pitiful some demons and spirits were, Xianxia was already accustomed to their actions. In his eyes, they were innately evil, and it would have come as a shock to him had they been benevolent and friendly toward humans. Hence, even though he had always given it his all when slaying demons and eliminating fiends, never had he been so furious. The man in front of him was a chi refiner who had renounced the path of righteousness to pursue one of evil, and that was why he was so enraged. Fueled by his rage, Xianxia's attacks had become even more formidable. That prized saber of his was a divine weapon that countless martial artists would have dreamed of. In his hands, it was giving off dazzling radiance and an incredibly formidable aura, to the point that the rain falling from the sky didn't even get a chance to hit the ground before it was completely pulverized in midair. In contrast, even though the black-robed man had made talismanic inscriptions on the blade of his sword, his body was decayed, while his will had also been whittled away, and he resembled an elderly man on his deathbed. He was only just barely able to maintain his cultivation base at the 5th tier, but his aura had already completely wilted away. No matter how wide a river is, without any water running through it, it's nothing more than a ditch in the ground. With no energy to feed on, the talismanic inscriptions on his sword only had a very minimal enhancement effect on his speed and power. On the 2nd floor of the boudoir, the female ghost was finally unable to bear watching any longer, and she rose up with one hand covering her own face, while her other hand was holding a pillar to support her enormous frame. As soon as she appeared, numerous tree roots that were as thick as the arms of grown men shot out of the walls, the ground, and the pillars of the courtyard like speeding arrows. Xianxia had gained the clear upper hand, but all of a sudden, the tables had turned, and he found himself in a very perilous situation. Even so, he displayed no fear as he crossed through the courtyard, dodging some of the arrow-like tree roots that were flying his way and severing others with his saber. It was as if the danger that he was in had further ignited his heroic spirit, and he burst into laughter. I knew you were a tree spirit. Come. I'll sever all of your roots, but I'll make sure to leave you just barely clinging onto your final breath, so that you can be baked to death under the light of the sun. Right at this moment, Zhang Shan came rushing onto the scene through the corridor with a pair of yellow paper talismans on his calves. These talismans allowed him to run like the wind, and he was moving so quickly that he was nothing more than a faint blur in the night. Mr. Su, I've come to help you slay the demons. Xianxia was struck by a vicious tree root to the shoulder, and he took advantage of the force of the blow to perform a pirouette in midair, then sever the tree root with his saber. The severed section of the tree root continued to thrash around incessantly after landing on the ground, while black blood was pouring out the section of tree root that shrank back into the wall, giving off a putrid odor. That, in addition to the dark and heavy rain falling from the heavens, gave the entire courtyard an overwhelming sinister aura. Thankfully, Xianxia possessed tremendous martial intent that formed a protective layer of golden light around his body. Spotting Zhang Shan rushing onto the scene, he threw up a mouthful of blood as he yelled in an exasperated voice. "I appreciate the thought, little Taoist priest, but if you really want to help me, then take your friend and leave this estate right now. Go to the nearest town and prepare some fine wine for when I make my triumphant return. That would be the biggest favor you can do me." However, Zhang Shan was unwilling to leave. As a Taoist priest, it was his duty to slay demons for the benefit of the people. As a side-branch disciple of Mount Longhu's heavenly master residence, even though he was far away from that holy land of Taoism, and he was just some unknown Taoist priest with very limited abilities, he was still one of the countless candidates to becoming an orthodox heavenly master of the Zhang clan. The talismans glued to his legs were the divine movement talismans that he had purchased for a steep price, and they could last roughly 15 minutes. Divine movement talismans were also known as armored horse talismans, and as their name suggested, they could help the user run as fast as a galloping horse, much like ancient deities riding atop gusts of wind. As such, divine movement talismans were considered to be a 7th-grade talisman, and no matter how expensive they were, the price was worth it for Zhang Shan, who had a frail body and lackluster combat prowess. As soon as he entered the fray, Zhang Shan made a hand seal, then cast his gaze up toward the boudoir on the 2nd floor as he commanded, "Go!" The peachwood sword on his back immediately shot forth, yet instead of directly flying toward the female tree spirit, it was following the movement of his fingers, flying through the air in a large arc. In the end, it skirted around a pillar, then flew toward the female tree spirit from the side at a vicious angle. Not only did the female tree spirit have to help her husband ward off the attacks of Xianxia, she now also had to deal with the peachwood sword that was hurtling toward her, and as a result, she no longer had the spare attention required to conceal her own face. As it turned out, half of her face was completely rotten with maggots crawling through her flesh and patches of bare bone exposed, while the other half of her face was riddled with cracks, like a piece of shattered chinaware. Her hideous appearance was truly nauseating, and a cowardly mortal could easily die from the intense fright of seeing such a ghastly sight. Several thin azure branches shot out of a nearby pillar, ensnaring the peachwood sword mere inches before its tip plunged into the female tree spirit's face. All of a sudden, a tiny speck of silver light appeared on the peachwood sword, and it surged up and down along the blade of the sword. This speck of light was a talismanic gallbladder, and all of the tree branches that came into contact with it were immediately set alight with plumes of smoke rising up from them. The female tree spirit let loose an agonized howl as she hurriedly twisted her head to the side, not daring to look at the speck of spiritual light any longer. At the same time, she frantically swept an arm through the air, hurling the clump of tree branches that were about to be incinerated into ashes toward the boudoir along with the peachwood sword that was still ensnared within the branches. Due to how quick and excessive her head-turning motion had been, large chunks of flesh and maggots flew off her face, landing on the reclining chair, and she began to sob in a distraught manner, perhaps out of pain, but perhaps also out of embarrassment. The black-robed man's calm demeanor finally cracked upon seeing this, and a pained look appeared on his face as he yelled, "You've gone too far. Why do you insist on working with that illegitimate mountain god to target me and my wife? Zhuojing may be a tree spirit, but she's never harmed a single soul. During the past century, aside from maintaining Zhuojing's vitality with my own lifeblood, all I've done is set up this formation in this estate that's been absorbing all of the sinister energies in a radius of 150 kilometers. In contrast, that illegitimate mountain god has been leeching off the natural fortune of the land to bolster his own cultivation base. You proclaim yourselves to be heroes and Taoist priests. Yet why are you targeting us instead of that illegitimate mountain god?" A look of grief and indignation appeared on the man's face as he continued, "Just because my wife and I aren't human, while that scoundrel is revered as a mountain god, you think that we must be evil, while he must be righteous, is that right?" The man raised his sword horizontally in front of his own chest, then lowered his head to look down at the bright gleam that it was giving off. Once upon a time, he had cultivated swordsmanship in the blessed paradise of the Divine Edict sect. He had been well-versed in inscription talismans and was once a handsome young prodigy with hopes of reaching the middle 5 tiers. However, all of that changed one day when he received a letter from his father, informing him that his fiancée, who he had known ever since they were children, had fallen severely ill. Even the most renowned doctor in the city had already given up on her, but in the letter, he was told to remain in the sect and focus on the cultivation, as even if he did return home, he most likely wasn't going to be able to make it in time to see her before she passed. The end of the letter implied that this marriage definitely wasn't going to become a stumbling block for his future rise in Divine Edict sect. He burned the letter and returned home as quickly as he could, but by then, she was already dead. He refused to listen to the pleas of his family, using a secret technique of Divine Edict sect to inscribe a soul-calling talisman with his own blood, then took the woman's body and drew upon what little remained of her soul, traveling deep into the mountains in the dead of night. During the day, he would hide in caves, then travel as quickly as he could after the sunset, trying to find a place with an abundance of energy in the hope that he could help guide her soul back to the realm of the living. During the subsequent century, he spent the entirety of his wealth and exhausted his cultivation base to build this estate, stealing the wood core of an ancestral elm tree of ancient elm nation and using a transplanting secret technique to connect the woman's soul with the core. There were no longer any legs beneath the skirt of her dress. All that remained was a mass of tree roots. This estate had been built to extend her life, but it had also become her prison. They pledged themselves to each other in marriage in the boudoir, kowtowing to heaven and earth, their parents and seniors, then finally to one another. The only person who refused to abandon them this entire time was the woman's personal maidservant, and even she had grown into an old woman. The black-robed man lowered his sword as he murmured in a broken voice, "If this is the state of the world, then there's no point for us to cling to life any longer." Xianxia also lowered his saber, then raised a hand to signal a truce. "Are there some hidden circumstances behind all of those that I don't know about?" A bleak smile appeared on the black-robed man's face as he revealed, "That illegitimate mountain god has already had his sights set on my estate for a very long time. I knew during the spring of this year that my remaining cultivation base will no longer be enough to keep those cowardly scoundrels at bay. So I had no choice but to go back on my word and send a secret letter back to the sect in the hope that the sect could send an immortal of the middle 5 tiers to intimidate the mountain god. However, to this day, I still haven't received any response, but that's only to be expected. The sect has already been extremely kind not to hunt me down. Who would want to get involved in such a filthy mess? If I were still in the sect and heard such an abhorrent story, I would have found it difficult to suppress the urge to storm out of the sect and hunt down the perpetrator." Xianxia approached Xianxia, then said in a low voice, "My divine movement talismans aren't going to be able to last much longer. If this is a trap, then I really will have to retreat with my friend." However, he then smiled as he continued, "But I don't think he's lying." Xianxia was faced with a difficult predicament, unsure of what to believe. If a disciple of Divine Edict sect were willing to come here, even if it were just an outer sect cultivator of the 2nd or 3rd tier, that would be enough to prove the innocence of the man and the tree spirit. As the leading Taoist sect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, the Divine Edict sect had the privilege of being overseen by a heavenly lord. To put it in blunt terms, even an external disciple responsible for carrying out menial chores in the sect had more authority than the masters of some smaller Taoist sections. Even though the battle had come to a temporary conclusion, none of the 4 people present dared to let down their guard, particularly the woman up in the boudoir. Prior to this, she had always been protected extremely well by her husband, but during this battle, countless roots of hers had been severed by Xianxia, and the peachwood sword had also given her a massive fright. She had always known that this day would inevitably come, but now that it had arrived, she was still at a complete loss for what to do. She felt like she was a perpetual burden on her husband, and she was racked with guilt. Right at this moment, 2 formidable auras suddenly appeared elsewhere in the estate as a figure dressed in a Taoist robe descended out of the heavens. However, for some reason, instead of traveling straight to the boudoir, they chose to refrain from entering that section of the estate. The male and female owners of the estate had already heard the sounds of battle ringing out from that direction, but they were too busy dealing with Xianxia to worry about what was happening elsewhere. Hence, the only one left to oppose those who had just infiltrated the estate was the old woman, who had already regained her consciousness at this point. As for the illegitimate mountain god and Taoist white deer, they had left just as quickly as they had come, and both of them had been yelling frantically about a sword immortal and bonded flying swords. It was as if they had encountered a true immortal and had fled for their lives in a panic. "Go take a look, little Taoist priest," Xianxia instructed in a quiet voice. Xianxia faltered slightly upon hearing this. Despite the casual tone of Xianxia's voice, Xianxia could tell from the look in his eyes that the man was telling him to leave this place for his own safety. A sense of excitement mixed with melancholy welled up in Zhang Shan's heart. He was ecstatic that he had finally found someone with the same objectives as him, willing to lay down their lives to slay demons and protect the innocent. Even in the lair of the enemy, his heroic spirit and courage didn't waver in the slightest. And this was the type of person that Zhang Shan had always yearned to become. However, at the same time, he was greatly saddened by how useless he was. Zhang Shan didn't say anything as he caught the peach-wood sword that flew back to him from the boudoir, then turned and rushed away with what little time remained in the divine movement talismans on his legs. Meanwhile, the black-robed man's brows were tightly furrowed, and he didn't know whether this was a positive or negative development. Could it be that Divine Edict sect really had sent disciples to this place? His body was already in terrible condition, and this battle was sure to have gone a long way to pushing him to an early grave. The woman was concerned for him, and she could no longer bear to hide in the boudoir any longer, slowly stepping forward to reveal her enormous body for the first time. The reclining chair on the second floor was split apart down the middle, and the woman descended into the courtyard, looking as if she were standing atop a massive tree stump. Behind her was a large section of ancient tree root, and she reached out her trembling hands to stroke the man's face as she made a string of unintelligible sounds, cursing herself for her inability to speak. The man consoled her in a gentle voice. "Don't be scared. Perhaps the sect really did send some people to help us." Xianxia heaved a faint sigh and plunged the tip of his saber into the ground while resting his hand on its hilt. Even if these two really were sinister ghostly creatures, the love that they had for each other was certainly genuine. After scaring the illegitimate mountain god and Taoist white deer into retreat, Chun Ping'an picked up the armor pellet and stowed it away in his pocket treasure. After that, he silently made his way into the section of the courtyard where Xianxia was situated, ready to assist him with his flying swords. His plan was to have 15th strike down the black-robed man with a single well-timed attack, while first would be responsible for stalling the female ghost and keeping her occupied. However, right as he was about to release his two flying swords out of his sword-nurturing gourd, he discovered that a temporary truce had been reached, and both sides had laid down their weapons. After that, Chun Ping'an heard the black-robed man tell his story, and he couldn't tell whether the black-robed man was telling the truth, so he decided to conceal his own aura and hide behind a pillar in silence. After Xianxia instructed Zhang Shan to leave, Chun Ping'an hesitated momentarily before springing up into the air, using the pillar that he was hiding behind as a launching pad to propel himself through the air. He passed through the corridor in a flash, gently patting the horizontal beams under the eaves one after another to continue propelling himself forward through the air like an agile swimming fish. It didn't take long before arrived in the courtyard outside, and he gently landed on the ground in front of the room that he had previously been staying in, then sat down onto the doorstep. In the same instant that he sat down, Zhang Shan rushed onto the scene. "Chun Ping'an," Zhang Shan called out in an urgent voice. "We have to pack our things and leave this place right now. Mr. Su is telling us to go to the nearest town. The situation is a bit complicated, so I'll tell you about it on the way there." Chun Ping'an rose to his feet, then pointed in the direction of the estate's front entrance as he said, "Someone's come in?" Sure enough, a group of people had made their way into the estate through the front gate, then folded up their oil paper umbrellas and were heading directly toward the section of the courtyard that Chun Ping'an and Zhang Shan were situated in. All of them were dressed in pristine and elegant Taoist robes with fishtail hats on their heads. The group consisted of 5 Taoist priests of different genders and ages. All of them were displaying remarkable dispositions. The elderly male Taoist priest at the forefront of the group appeared to be their leader, and even in the darkness of the night, his eyes were bright and piercing, clearly indicating that he was a formidable immortal. As for the other 4 people in the group, one of them was a young Taoist priest who appeared to be around 20 years of age. He was holding a copper bell in one hand, and there was a long sword in a black scabbard strapped to his back, with a long string of yellow tassels attached to the hilt. There were also a young boy and young girl with a similar physical appearance. Both of them had haughty looks on their faces, and one of them had a long black rope coiled around the waist, while the other was carrying a beautiful azure and yellow bamboo whip. The group was rounded out by a small child with a wide grin on his face. He was the shortest of the bunch, and his legs were also the stubbiest, so he was having to run a little to keep up with the others. In his hand was an unremarkable-looking rectangular wooden block, but the phrase, "All ghosts shall bow," were inscribed upon it in ancient characters. "Those are humans, not demons, master," the young man remarked. The elderly Taoist priest nodded in response, then paid no further heed to Chun Ping'an and Zhang Shan as he walked right past them. The rest of the group also didn't display much interest toward Chenpingen, but they were all rather intrigued by Xianxia's Taoist hat and Taoist robe, seemingly taking an interest in his attire. Thus, the procession of 5 Taoist priests passed through, and in the instant that the elderly Taoist priest stepped into the other section of the courtyard, he immediately roared in a furious voice, "Traitor Yang Huang, come out and repent for your crimes." A sense of elation mixed with concern instantly welled up in the black-robed man's heart upon hearing this familiar voice. He was elated as the elderly Taoist priest was undoubtedly an internal disciple of Divine Edict sect, which meant that the letter that he had sent out had achieved its intended purpose, after all. Even though he had already been stripped of his status as a Taoist priest by the sect, they still hadn't completely abandoned him. Now that members of the sect had been sent down to investigate this matter, the illegitimate mountain god's days were undoubtedly numbered. However, at the same time, his elation was outweighed by his concern. The elderly Taoist priest was among the same generation of disciples as him. They were both prodigies who had joined Divine Edict sect in the same year, and their respective masters were senior and junior brothers to one another, while their grandmasters were the same person. However, the two of them shared a terrible relationship, and even back in Divine Edict sect, they had constantly been at each other's throats. Now, one was a high and mighty immortal, while the other was a pathetic half-human, half-ghost creature, and he would be powerless to resist if the elderly Taoist priest decided to take advantage of this opportunity to exact vengeance upon him. The elderly Taoist priest was supported by Divine Edict sect, while the black-robed man no longer had that privilege. Yang Huang positioned himself in front of the woman, then gently pierced the tip of his long sword into the ground before extending a deep bow toward the elderly Taoist priest. "I'm willing to accept any punishment the sect decides to hand down upon me." The elderly Taoist priest stepped into the courtyard with a mocking look on his face as he sneered. "Looks like you've been doing quite well for yourself this past century, Yang Huang." Xianxia turned to take a glance at the 5 Taoist priests, but instead of approaching them, he turned back to Yang Huang as he cupped his fist in a salute while extending a slight "now." "My sincerest apologies for attacking you without hearing the full story first. If you have any need for my services in the future, I'll be sure to heed your call." Having traveled the world for over 20 years, Xianxia had a very keen eye, and he was immediately able to tell that Yang Huang and the elderly Taoist priest of the Divine Edict sect were at odds with one another. What was supposed to have been a positive development had suddenly taken an unfortunate turn. The group of 5 Taoist priests were extremely arrogant in appearance, looking as if they wanted nothing more than to brandish signs proclaiming their identity as Divine Edict sect disciples. Zhang Shan couldn't help but heave an internal sigh at the sight of them. As expected of Taoist priests of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, all of them were extremely well-dressed. In contrast, Zhang Shan's shabby attire left him feeling quite embarrassed. However, he was still concerned for the safety of Xianxia, so he dragged Chenpingen away to a nearby pillar, then crouched down beside the railing to observe the situation from afar. At this point, the elderly Taoist priest had already stepped into the severely ravaged courtyard with his 4 juniors, and as he walked along with his hand clasped behind his back, he discreetly made a hand signal that was unique to their sect. The other 4 Taoist priests immediately flew away in different directions to surround Yang Huang and Zhuo Jing, with the sword-bearing young man flying onto the wall of the courtyard, looking much more like he was here to act as Yang Huang's tormentor than his savior. Yang Huang latched onto the hideous female ghost's hand as he said in a quiet voice, "May we continue to be husband and wife for all of our lifetimes to come." The female ghost was unable to utter any intelligible words, but everyone knew that she was repeating the same thing to Yang Huang. Chenpingen was planning to observe the situation as nothing more than a detached bystander, but that was all it took for him to abruptly break down into tears, and even he was rather surprised by his own reaction. His childhood memories were rather blurry, and there were many things that he couldn't recall clearly, but there was one memory that remained clear in his mind to this very day. His father had been a rather awkward man who wasn't very good with his words, and in that memory, he had said perhaps the only romantic thing that he had ever said in his entire life. "Will we continue to be together in the next lifetime?" Chenpingen's mother had been mending some clothes at the time, and she smiled as she replied, "Why not?" Chenpingen had been sitting on his mother's lap at the time, and he was too young to truly grasp concepts like life and death, but for some reason, the expressions on the faces of his parents in that moment really stuck in his mind. As time passed, his parents passed away, and Chenpingen felt like if one truly loved someone else, then a single lifetime together wasn't enough. That was what had prompted this emotional response. Zhang Shan noticed Chenpingen's reaction out of the corner of his eye, and he rubbed a hand over his own face with a rather perplexed expression. While it was true that the rain was quite heavy, surely it wasn't to the point that Chun Pingin's entire face would be covered in rain. On top of that, the storm had already petered out into a light drizzle, one that someone could comfortably stand under even without the shelter provided by an umbrella. With that in mind, Xianxia asked in a concerned voice, "Are you all right, Chun Pingin?" Chun Pingin hurriedly rubbed a hand over his own face, then forced a smile as he nodded in response. "I'm fine. It's just that my reactions are a bit slow, and with all of the strange stuff that's happened tonight, the fear has only just caught up to me. Now that I've had a chance to process things, I suddenly felt so scared that I wanted to cry." Zhang Shan patted Chun Pingin on the shoulder as he turned his head away, fighting the urge to laugh as he said, "Never mind. I didn't see anything." The elderly Taoist priest inspected his surroundings for a moment, then cast his gaze toward Yang Huang as he sneered. "How the tables have turned. I must say, I'm very much moved by your love for each other. What do you think I should do with you, Yang Huang? Should I follow the rules of our sect? Or should I not follow the rules of our sect and punish you based on what I feel like is appropriate, given our personal relationship?" Yang Huang gritted his teeth tightly in silence, and he was just about to fall to his knees to beg the elderly Taoist priest to spare them when Xianxia opened his mouth to interject, unable to bear watching this miscarriage of justice any longer. However, before he had a chance to say anything, the elderly Taoist priest turned to him with a steely expression as he yelled, "All unrelated individuals should keep their mouths shut. This is an internal affair of our divine edict sect. Outsiders like you have no say in this matter." Xianxia was so furious that his eyes had turned bloodshot, and he was having to fight back the urge to lash out with his saber. But in the end, he could only heave a resigned sigh. If someone like him dared to meddle in the affairs of such a powerful sect, he would simply be giving his life for nothing. Despite his heroic nature, he knew that at times, backing down was the wisest option. Right at this moment, Chun Pingin turned and handed Zhang Shan the armor pellet as he said, "Take this, Zhang Shan. From this moment forth, we're complete strangers." Zhang Shan pushed the armor pellet back, then leaned in closer to Chun Pingin as he said, "Don't do anything rash, Chun Pingin. If you lash out first, then all of the blame will fall on you. I know how to deal with these high and mighty Taoist priests, and my strategy will definitely be more effective than fighting them. Just remember that when I'm beaten up by them, don't intervene. Otherwise, all of my efforts will go to waste." "Are you sure this will work?" Chun Pingin asked. "We may as well give it a try," Zhang Shan replied with a wide smile. "You can always step in if it doesn't work." Despite what he was saying, Zhang Shan naturally wasn't actually counting on Chun Pingin. In his eyes, Chun Pingin was only a third-tier martial artist, so there was nothing that he could do in this situation. With that in mind, Zhang Shan was praying to the ancestors of the three teachings for his plan to work. Zhang Shan stood up and smoothed down his robes, then strode into the courtyard with a righteous look on his face as he yelled, "Everyone, please listen to me." Everyone present immediately turned to look at him with different expressions. The young boy from Divine Edict sect with the length of black rope coiled around his waist turned to Zhang Shan with a displeased look on his face, and he unwound the rope from around his waist before casually tossing it through the air. The rope instantly unfurled on its own in midair like a spirit snake, tying Zhang Shan up in the blink of an eye. As a result, Zhang Shan almost fell over as he swayed from side to side, and he was only just barely able to keep himself upright. "Why should we have to listen to you?" the young boy from Divine Edict sect asked with a cold sneer. "You're just some fake Taoist priest of unknown origins. If you don't shut your mouth, I'll throw you out of this courtyard." A furious look appeared on Zhang Shan's face as he yelled, "My name is Zhang Shan, and I am a disciple of spiritual master Fire Dragon of Heavensoar sect on complete Reed continent, and I am a member of the Zhang clan of Mount Longhu. I've embarked on a long journey to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent in order to hone my Tao heart and complete the examination set for me by Mount Longhu. As soon as I return home, I'll officially become a Taoist priest of the Heavenly Master Residence. You may be from Divine Edict sect, but that doesn't give you the right to insult a member of Mount Longhu's Zhang clan." The young boy from Divine Edict sect was rather lacking in life experience, and he was looking a little dumbstruck by Zhang Shan's fiery demeanor. It was clear that he was intimidated by the mention of Mount Longhu and the Heavenly Master Residence, and he didn't know how Divine Edict sect stacked up against those places. The fact that the Heavenly Master Residence was known in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, even though they were on another continent, indicated that they were not to be messed with. As for Mount Longhu on Middle-earth Divine Continent, that was an even more vastly renowned place that didn't fall under any branches of Taoism. Instead, it was an independent Taoist orthodoxy of its own, so of course the young boy from Divine Edict sect had heard of it. But the stories that he had heard were limited only to some unofficial myths and legends, most of which were being spread by ignorant mortals. Generally speaking, no Qi refiner took these stories seriously and merely regarded them as jokes. But as the most prominent Taoist sect on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, those of Divine Edict sect knew far more about the true power of the Heavenly Master residents than others. The Heavenly Master of the Zhang clan wielded a seal alongside an immortal sword and possessed boundless Tao power and combat prowess. Even on Middle-earth Divine Continent, which was rife with powerful immortals, he was ranked among the continent's top 10 immortals of the upper 5 tiers. His position of superiority was quite similar to that of Heavenly Lord Qizhen on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, and that was why the young boy felt intimidated by Zhang Shan's claims. Zhang Shan knew the importance of striking while the iron was still hot, and he scrutinized the elderly Taoist priest intently as he continued. As for a former disciple of Divine Edict sect, Yang Huang may have fallen from grace, but he did so for the sake of love, and even in the eyes of us outsiders, his actions are commendable. At the very least, we think that he and his wife are deserving of our sympathy. As the leader of the Taoist orthodoxy on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, surely Divine Edict sect should have the generosity and graciousness befitting such a lofty status, should it not? The youngest Taoist priest of the bunch, the child holding the rectangular wooden block, gently tugged on the sleeve of the young girl as he asked in a quiet voice, "I think Heavenly Master Zhang is right, senior sister. What do you think?" The young girl shook her head in response. "Don't listen to him spout nonsense." Chun Ping'an found this to be a very eye-opening experience, but at the same time, he was a little perplexed as he glanced over at the roof of the boudoir out of the corner of his eye. Zhang Shan wanted to point at the elderly Taoist priest in order to lend more impact to his words, only to find that he was unable to do so as he was bound tightly by the black rope. Instead, he skipped a step forward with a cold smile on his face as he said, "On top of that, you and Yang Huang were once fellow brothers of the same generation of disciples from Divine Edict sect. So why is it that you insist on targeting him in your reunion instead of catching up and talking about old memories over a drink? When it comes to the heavenly masters of our Zhang clan, regardless of whether we've been officially anointed or not, as long we encounter one another during our travels, then we'll be sure to catch up like good friends. So why does your Divine Edict sect not share the same culture? Besides, while it's true that I'm also a cultivator and a descendant of Mount Longhu's Zhang clan, even I'm well versed in the principle that there are always exceptions to every rule." A cold tone crept into Zhang Shan's voice as he continued. "Could it be that you have a personal vendetta against Yang Huang, and that's why you're renouncing the teachings of your sect in order to force this pair of husband and wife to their deaths? I raise this as a possibility, but I don't think it's a very likely one. I can tell just from a single glance that you're a very generous man. After tonight, I'll be sure to speak highly of yourself and Divine Edict sect to everyone that I meet. Even when I return to Mount Longhu someday, I'll look back on Divine Edict sect in a favorable light." The elderly Taoist priest had his hands clasped behind his back as he stood in silence. All of a sudden, the young Taoist priest standing on top of the wall uttered a sentence that no one present was able to understand. Zhang Shan was rather perplexed by what he had heard, and to his surprise, the young man reverted back to the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent as he stabbed a finger in Zhang Shan's direction and yelled in a furious voice, "You're a fraud! I just asked you a question in the official dialect of Complete Reed Continent. Why are you unable to answer me? Posing as a descendant of Mount Longhu's Zhang clan here on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent is a blatant act of disrespect and blasphemy to our continent's Taoist orthodoxy. You better kneel down and repent for your crimes before I strike you down where you stand." Zhang Shan was astonished to have encountered someone so shameless, and he erupted into a furious tirade, hurling a torrent of abuse at the young Taoist priest in the true official dialect of Complete Reed Continent, then switched back to the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent as he yelled, "That's utter nonsense. Is this how low Divine Edict sect is willing to sink just to further its own nefarious means? How pitiful it is that this is the state of the leader of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Taoist orthodoxy." However, the young Taoist priest standing atop the wall paid no heed to him, turning to the elder Taoist priest as he smiled and said, "Master, I've already determined that this person isn't from Complete Reed Continent. As for whether he's truly a descendant of Mount Longhu's Zhang clan, that's still yet to be seen. I suggest we throw him out of the courtyard and take care of this ghostly couple first before we decide what we should do with him." The elderly Taoist priest seemed to be moved by the idea, and he was just about to speak when Xianxia was finally unable to suppress his fury any longer. He strode forward with his saber brandished, and as he did so he chortled, "I'm just a complete nobody. and I certainly have no way to dissuade all of you from carrying out justice on behalf of Divine Edict Sect in any way that you please, but if you insist on punishing Yang Huang according to the rules of your sect, then I'm going to have to listen to the rules of Divine Edict Sect and determine for myself if they hold any merit. However, if you're going to kill Yang Huang and his wife without following the rules, then even if I have to lay down my own life here, I'll be sure to oppose you to my final breath. The young boy from Divine Edict Sect who had ensnared Zhang Shan with his demon-binding rope suddenly asked, "You proclaim that you're from a sect on complete Reed Continent under Mount Longhu. In that case, do you have a passport to prove that you're from complete Reed Continent and a descendant of the Zhang clan? If you don't have the proof, then you're not going to be able to get away with posing as a heavenly master of Mount Longhu." A hesitant look appeared on Zhang Shan's face, and Su Yuanxia's brows also furrowed slightly in concern. If Zhang Shan really had lied about his identity as a distant relative of the esteemed immortals on Mount Longhu, then that was a serious crime. Divine Edict Sect had the right to oversee the Taoist orthodoxy of the entire continent, so if Zhang Shan were found guilty of such a crime, then he would surely be handed down a severe punishment. Zhang Shan took a deep breath, then turned to Chen Ping'an as he said, "Chen Ping'an, help me retrieve my passport from my bags." A wry smile appeared on Yang Huang's face as he turned to look at his wife, and she nodded in response, seemingly aware of what his intentions were. Thus, Yang Huang turned back to face everyone as he said, "Mr. Su, Taoist priest Zhang, I appreciate everything you've done for me, and if I am fortunate enough to be reincarnated, I'll be sure to repay you in my next life. Regardless of whether Divine Edict Sect punishes us according to its rules, or whether these people decide to punish us based on past personal vendettas, Zhu Jing and I accept our fate." Having said that, please don't come to the false conclusion that everyone in our Divine Edict Sect is. That is absolutely not the case. Yang Huang's was standing up straighter and straighter as he spoke, and it was as if he had cast aside all of his inhibitions and the indignations of the past century as he pointed a finger directly at the elderly Taoist priest and continued, "Idiots like him, who only focus on cultivation without making any efforts to better themselves as people, are part of the minority in our Divine Edict Sect. It's no wonder that 100 years have passed by, yet you're still only at the 5th tier Zhao Lu. I was already at the 5th tier 100 years ago, and if I recall correctly, you were still only a pathetic 3rd tier chi refiner. No wonder that tier is considered to be such a major hurdle. It's almost as if it were designed to obstruct selfish and foolish bastards like yourself." Yang Huang had done away with all of his reservations and had spoken his mind without any regard for the consequences. The younger Taoist priests of Divine Edict Sect could only look back and forth at one another with awkward looks on their faces, while the sword-bearing Taoist priest who referred to Zhao Lu as his master was infuriated. Intense killing intent was radiating from his body, and the long sword in the scabbard behind his back was ready to spring forth at a moment's notice. However, he couldn't deny that Yang Huang's scathing words held a great deal of truth. Zhao Lu's cultivation base had remained stagnant at the 3rd tier for several decades before he was finally able to make a breakthrough, and the young swordsman had also been stuck at this tier for a very long time. Once upon a time, he had been considered a prodigy, a diamond in the rough that had hopes of reaching the middle 5 tiers. However, over time, he had fallen into obscurity, and now, it had been deemed that he had virtually no chance of ever acquiring a bonded flying sword. As a result, his status in Divine Edict Sect had plummeted drastically in just the past decade alone. Back at the height of his powers, he was even able to occasionally exchange a few words with the Golden Boy and Jade Girl of the continent, and that was an enormous honor. In particular, during a conversation that he had shared with Xiaoyang once upon a time, she had even flashed him a smile. It was such a rare and breathtaking sight, and he didn't care that it was only a gesture made out of politeness. She was a woman that was being desperately pursued even by an almighty sword immortal, and he was no ordinary sword immortal. He was the youngest swordsman to have ever reached the upper 5 tiers in the entire history of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. As for him, he was only able to follow a master with no hope of ever attaining the Great Tao, accompanying a bunch of kids on a pointless trip for his master to exact vengeance on an old rival under the guise of carrying out official sect duties. It was made out to be a journey undertaken for training purposes, but on the way here, all he had done was slay some spirits that still hadn't attained intelligence and eradicated some demons that still hadn't even attained human forms yet. Now, he was here engaged in a pointless squabble with a Taoist priest from a foreign continent and a wandering hero, and the futility of the situation matched the hopelessness of his cultivation career. Hence, he was just about to draw his sword in a fit of rage. This ghostly traitor and his tree spirit wife were deserving of death anyway. No matter how inept he was still a 3rd-tier swordsman, and he had curried some favor with a few of the sect's elders and even the golden boy back when he was still considered a prodigy. So even if he were punished for his actions here, the punishment would only be limited to copying scriptures or some other symbolic punishment that was nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and he had nothing to fear. All of a sudden, a teasing voice rang out without any warning. "Don't go around drawing your sword over every little thing." Everyone turned in unison to the direction that the voice had come from, and they discovered a burst of faint ripples in the night sky there. Whoever it was that had arrived on the scene, they seemed to have been using some type of advanced concealment talisman, and they had actually been observing the proceedings this entire time. At this moment, they finally revealed themselves, and it was a young woman who wasn't exactly slender, but didn't fall into the category of portly, either. She had a set of round and rosy cheeks and was wearing bright red attire, giving her a very festive appearance. A slightly panicked look appeared on Zhao Lu's face as he hurriedly cupped his fist in a salute and extended a deep bow. Zhao Lu pays his respects to Senior Aunt Fu. "How do you know me?" the young woman standing atop the flying sword asked with a perplexed expression. There was a fawning smile on Zhao Lu's face as he replied, "There's no disciple throughout the entire Divine Edict sect who doesn't know of your esteemed self, Senior Aunt Fu." A dark look suddenly appeared on the young woman's face as she asked with a cold smile, "Has the entire sect already been made aware that the golden boy turned down my confession of love to him? Which member of our sect had nothing better to do than run their mouth and gossip to you about me? I'll be sure to show them my gratitude once I return to the sect." Not only was Zhao Lu completely befuddled by what he had heard, everyone else was just as confused. They knew of this young woman not because of any romantic confession she had made. Instead, it was because she was a figure of a very high level of seniority in the sect, and she had astonishingly powerful backers to boot. Her favorite pastime was to fly as quickly as she could atop her flying sword between the mountains of the sect. She was constantly flying around throughout the year, and her penchant for bright red clothing made her stand out even more. The maneuver that she liked to perform the most was to ride her sword straight up into the heavens, then plummet directly downward from dizzying heights, only to abruptly swerve mere 20 to 30 feet from the ground before gliding away in a flashy fashion, often only avoiding disaster by mere inches. There was no other swordsman who was as reckless as her, and over time, she gradually earned a resounding reputation for herself in the sect. 2 years ago, she had tried to cut the margins down even further, only reversing the direction of her fall at a height of just 10 feet above the ground. As it turned out, that wasn't enough space to work with, and she crashed headfirst into the ground, sticking out of the ground alongside her flying sword like a pair of radishes waiting to be picked. All of the spectating disciples had been cheering and clapping just a moment ago, only to be stunned into silence by this outcome. Only after a scolding from Xiaoyang, who she was on very good terms with, did she begin to exercise some restraint in her reckless endeavors. Not long after that, she broke through her 5th-tier bottleneck and reached the cave abode tier of the middle 5 tiers. After that, she began whizzing around Divine Edict sect atop her flying sword once again, constantly flying past in front of the cave abodes of all of the old immortals residing on the sect's mountains. All of them were accustomed to peaceful cultivation, so they were naturally very disgruntled by this, but the young woman's great-grandfather was the master of Divine Edict sect's current sect master, Qi Zhen. Hence, Qi Zhen was always quite cold and detached toward everyone else, but he favored this young woman over even the golden boy and jade girl. Upon seeing the expressions on everyone's faces, the young woman immediately realized that not only had she misinterpreted things, she had just aired out her own dirty laundry for everyone to hear, and she was so embarrassed that she wanted to fly away into the night. However, she then recalled the promise that she had made to Xiaoyang and the golden boy, so she could only endure her fury and embarrassment as she stood on the rooftop with a stern expression, contemplating how she could end things here as soon as possible. Just like many other sects, Divine Edict sect was split up into the inner sect and the outer sect. Prior to Xiaoyang's departure from Divine Edict sect, both the golden boy and jade girl of the continent had belonged to the same sect, and that was an extremely rare occurrence. In order to train these two prodigies, Qi Zhen had instructed them to oversee the outer sect's affairs. Of course, he hadn't just thrust such a huge responsibility upon them, then allowed them to make their own decisions without any supervision. Instead, he adopted a system much like what was seen in mortal empires, with imperial censors supervising all of the imperial court's officials. Furthermore, they would also occasionally be assigned the responsibility of taking care of some of the mortal external missions solely on their own. In those cases, they would write down their advice for how to handle the matter in question before handing down this advice to the external disciples that were responsible for addressing the sect's mortal affairs. After everything was said and done, Xiaoyang and the Golden Boy would also have the right to assess and evaluate the performance of said external disciples. Hence, as the Jade Girl of Eastern Treasured Vial, continent's Taoist orthodoxy, Divine Edict sect had truly spared no effort in nurturing and honing Xiaoyang's abilities. That was why many people were bewildered by her decision to leave the sect, including a great number of the senior figures in Divine Edict sect, and it resulted in many of them denouncing her for being an ungrateful traitor. Xiaoyang had been one of the brightest young prodigies on the entire continent, and it was precisely because Divine Edict sect had invested so much into her development that her departure from the sect had hurt those in the sect so deeply. The secret letter that Yang Huang had sent to Divine Edict sect had actually already arrived as early as the New Year's, and back then, Xiaoyang hadn't yet left the sect. An argument had erupted between her and the Golden Boy over this letter, with the latter presenting his verdict first. In his opinion, Yang Huang's actions were understandable, so there was no need to administer too severe a punishment. However, Xiaoyang held the completely opposite viewpoint on this matter, and her verdict had been extremely harsh and scathing, stating that as a former disciple of Divine Edict sects, Yang Huang's fall into depravity was utterly deplorable, and a severe punishment had to be handed down in order to set an example. However, when it came to the female ghost, both of them shared the same opinion, which was that she should simply be left to her own devices. Due to their conflicting views on this matter, the letter was temporarily set aside. Initially, Divine Edict sect had leaned more toward Xiaoyang, seeing her verdict as the more appropriate course of action to take. However, no one could have anticipated Xiaoyang's sudden departure from the sect shortly thereafter, and she had been so determined in her departure that she had even been willing to abandon her status as the Jade Girl of the continent. The Golden Boy had loved and admired Xiaoyang for many years, and he seemed to have viewed that letter as the reason for her departure, so he was unwilling to even mention the subject from there onward. On top of that, he had countless other things that he had to take care of, so he gave the letter to an external elder of the sect, telling him to assign some disciples who were traveling out of the sect for training purposes with the task of taking care of this matter, and that there was no need to consider the conflicting verdicts handed down by himself and Xiaoyang. Zhao Lu had eagerly pounced on this opportunity, traveling out of the sect to exact vengeance on Yang Huang, but the round-faced young woman had also heard about this matter from somewhere, and she decided to follow the group of Taoist priests in secret so that she could get away from the sect and take her mind off the Golden Boy who had turned down her confession. She flew over a vast distance atop her flying sword, and she was thoroughly enjoying the experience. All of the high and mighty master martial artists and powerful itinerant cultivators that she encountered had immediately turned into sycophantic dogs as soon as they were informed of her status in Divine Edict sect. While it was true that she could have been lying to them, the precious lotus flower hat that she wore on her head and the golden jade pendant attached to her belt were clear indications of her status. Following her emergence, both Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shan knew that the fate of Yang Huang and Zhu Jing were no longer in their hands, so there was no point in speaking further about this matter. Ultimately, the decision would have to be made by the young woman. Yang Huang grabbed onto Zhu Jing's hand, then raised her head to face the young woman with a calm smile as he said, Yang Huang and Zhu Jing are willing to accept any punishment handed down by Senior Aunt Fu, whether it means we live or we die. The young woman took a glance at the couple. One of them was as thin and gaunt like a skeleton, while the other was utterly hideous, so she simply couldn't bring herself to feel any affection for them. Of course, she harbored no disdain for them either. She thought back to the pair of conflicting verdicts on the matter and heaved an internal sigh. Seeing as Xiaoyang was no longer a member of Divine Edict sect, the correct way to proceed would be to act according to the Golden Boy's verdict. With that in mind, she cleared her throat, then ordered, Zhao Lu, take everyone to the illegal temple and take care of matters there. As for whether that means eradicating the temple yourself or contacting the local authorities to do so, that's up to you. As for Yang Huang and Zhu Jing, no punishment will be handed down to you as long as you don't go around committing any nefarious deeds while claiming that you're members of Divine Edict sect. With the crisis averted, Zhu Jing was smiling with elation, but a heartbroken look immediately appeared on her face when she heard this. She turned her head to the side and covered her face with her hands, not daring to show her face any longer. All of a sudden, the little boy stopped cold in his tracks, remaining completely still on the spot. It wasn't that he didn't want to move, he simply didn't dare to move. Among the group of 5 Taoist priests, he was actually the most prized disciple of Divine Edict sect. He possessed outstanding cultivation aptitude and was naturally endowed with superb instincts, placing him above the twins and certainly above the young swordsman who had already been stuck at the 3rd tier for many years. He quickly turned around, and his palms were sweating profusely as he gripped tightly onto his demon-suppressing wood. His gaze slowly roamed over the faces of the people present. There was the hideous Zhuojing, the sickly Yang Huang, the saber-wielding Su Yuanxia, the self-proclaimed heavenly master Zhang of Mount Longhu, who was very likely a Taoist priest from complete Reed continent, and finally, there was the expressionless young boy with the wooden box on his back. Everyone had merely brushed off his taunting of Zhuojing as nothing more than a mischievous gesture from a little boy, but Chen Pingyan had extended 2 of his fingers before making a subtle forward-thrusting motion. The little boy gulped nervously, then forced a smile onto his own face as he politely waved farewell to Chen Pingyan. All the while, his instincts were screaming to him to get away from Chen Pingyan as soon as possible. The little boy was feeling very much spooked as he rushed out of the courtyard. From his perspective, the aura surrounding Chen Pingyan was one that should have only come from an old monster of the middle 5 tiers, and one that had endured countless battles of life and death, at that. The little boy didn't consider goading Zhao Lu and the others to turn back and strike down Chen Pingyan and the others, as there was simply no point in such a gesture. On the path of cultivation, it was always best to have as few distractions from cultivation as possible, so unnecessary trouble was to be avoided at all costs. As the little boy was rushing along, a faint smile appeared on his face, and his mood also began to improve. Just as his master had told him, there really were powerful beings even in the mortal world, and he had just run into one such being. Once he returned to the sect, he was going to tell his master that he had encountered an old monster who was at least at the golden core tier. Perhaps he was even a 10th tier earth immortal, but for some reason he was shamelessly posing as a young boy. The little boy was so enthused by this thought that he jumped up into the air and mused happily to himself. This trip was definitely worthwhile. The twins walking through the corridor up ahead both turned around upon hearing this, and the little boy immediately adopted an indifferent expression as he put on a mature facade, walking along in a calm manner rather than continuing to skip around. Back at the boudoir, Yang Huang and Zhuojing had been racked with fear and worry throughout the entirety of the recently concluded confrontation, but thankfully, they had managed to weather the storm. They held onto each other's hands and exchanged a smile in silence, feeling as if all of their suffering had been worth it, and that their fortunes had finally taken a turn for the better. Meanwhile, Zhang Shan turned to Chen Pingyan with a smile as he said, "Did you see that? That was a sword immortal. And she was so young too." Chen Pingyan could only respond with a slightly exasperated smile. At this point, the rain had already subsided, and Zhang Shan looked up at the night sky as he sighed, "I really want to recite a poem." Su Yuanxia burst into laughter. After this tumultuous process, a happy outcome had finally been reached. This was a much more satisfying and joyful experience for Su Yuanxia than slaying demons or drinking fine wine. Meanwhile, the old woman who had been knocked unconscious finally woke up, and she immediately rushed into the courtyard and was very relieved to find her master safe and well. Yang Huang turned to her with a smile and said, "It's all in the past now. We'll never have to worry about those cowardly scoundrels ever again." The old woman was initially dumbstruck to hear this, then immediately erupted into sobs of joy. Zhuojing drifted over to the old woman's side, draping an arm over her shoulders, as she made some gentle sounds of comfort and reassurance. Having just had a massive weight lifted from his shoulders, Yang Huang was completely revitalized, and a wide smile appeared on his face as he said, "Mr. Su, esteemed immortal Zhang, young Master Chen, if you're not opposed to the idea, how about you give us the chance to show you some hospitality as your hosts? We can have a chat over a table to fine wine and good dishes." Su Yuanxia nodded in response with a smile on his face, then turned to Zhang Shan and Chen Pingyan as he asked, "What do you two say?" "That certainly sounds very appealing to me," Zhang Shan replied with a smile of his own. Chen Pingyan also smiled as he nodded in response, then patted the wine gourd strapped to his waist as he said, "If possible, I'd like to buy some wine from you." Yang Huang waved a dismissive hand, and all of a sudden, it was as if he had returned to his glory days as the prodigious disciple of Divine Edict sect as he replied, "What do you mean by? We have some homebrewed wine that's not exactly high quality, but I can assure you that it's not lacking in taste. You can drink to your heart's content tonight and take as much of the wine with you as you like when you leave." Everyone erupted into laughter, and the dark and eerie atmosphere in the estate was instantly brightened. For the first time, a wide smile appeared on the old woman's face, and tears were still flowing down her face as she hurried into the kitchen to cook. Meanwhile, Yang Huang and Zhuojing invited everyone into the main hall, and they began to chat with Su Yuanxia about the things that he had seen along his journey. Zhang Shan hesitated momentarily, then called out to Chen Pingyan, leading him into the corridor outside as he said in an apologetic voice, "I have to come clean with you, Chen Pingyan. My name is actually Zhang Shanfeng, not Zhang Shan. Sorry to keep this a secret from you for so long even though we're friends. Chun Ping'an sat down onto the railing as he smiled and replied, It's always better to be safe than sorry when traveling on your own, so there's nothing for you to apologize for. Zhang Shanfeng's eyes lit up upon hearing this, and he replied, I knew it. You're also using a false alias as well, aren't you? The name Ping'an obviously has good connotations, but it's honestly a little bit shallow and tacky. It's my real name. Chun Ping'an snapped as he rolled his eyes in response. An awkward look immediately appeared on Zhang Shanfeng's face, and he was silent for a moment before a thought occurred to him. By the way, what was that ball you gave me earlier? Chun Ping'an internally apologized to Zhang Shanfeng for the lie that he was about to tell, then replied, Earlier, the battle taking place in the room across from the one that we were staying in was really loud, so I snuck out to take a look, and as it turned out, the scholar with the Chu surname was actually a tree spirit. He was killed by the sword immortal, and he left behind that ball, which he was referring to as an armor pellet. The sword immortal didn't seem to have been interested in the armor pellet, and after they left, I snuck over to pick it up. Chun Ping'an handed the armor pellet to Zhang Shanfeng again as he spoke. That sword immortal must have been that woman from Divine Edict sect, Zhang Shanfeng said as a look of realization appeared on his face, and he weighed the armor pellet in his hand for a moment to find that it wasn't very heavy. He then lowered his head to take a closer look, and he could see a tiny crack on the surface of the armor pellet. A solemn look appeared on his face as he handed the armor pellet back to Chun Ping'an and said, This really does look a lot like the armor pellets of militarianism, but this one seems to be severely damaged. There's a crack on its surface. Even so, all armor pellets are extremely precious treasures, and I don't know exactly how much this one is worth, but it's no exaggeration to call them virtually priceless. Make sure you keep this hidden and don't let anyone else see it. If you can find someone to repair it in the future, it'll be equivalent to the best life-saving talismans out there. According to the scholar with the Chu surname, this armor pellet was an extremely valuable treasure from the imperial vault of ancient Elm Nation, and it was worth 3,000 snowflake coins. Instead of stowing the armor pellet back into the pocket treasure up his sleeve, Chun Ping'an said, As you know, I'm a martial artist, and I specialize in fist techniques that have a focus on all-out attack and self-dependence, so I can't allow myself to rely on external objects. Otherwise, my fist intent will be compromised, and that'll have a detrimental effect on my cultivation. Hence, I don't have much use for this armor pellet, so I'll sell it to you for 300 snowflake coins. What do you say? Zhang Shanfeng shook his head vigorously as he replied with a self-deprecating smile. This is an extremely precious treasure that would be a bargain for 1,000 snowflake coins, let alone 300. If I had enough assets, I would gladly sell everything in my possession to purchase it from you, but that price is simply beyond my reach. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been struggling just to fill my belly back on the Kuan ship. Chun Ping'an tossed the armor pellet back to Zhang Shanfeng with a smile as he said, In that case, you can pay me the 300 snowflake coins once you save up the money. Don't be in such a hurry to refuse. Thinking about it, you're so frail that even a storm was enough to almost make you fall ill. If we encounter even more demons and spirits in the future, how are we going to be able to fight them? If you put on the armor, our chances of beating any demons and spirits that we encounter will improve significantly. And if we reap any spoils from our battles, they'll all go to me as a form of repayment for your debt. How does that sound? Zhang Shanfeng heaved a faint sigh, then carefully stowed away the armor pellet, something that he wouldn't even have dared to dream of owning in the past. He sat down beside Chun Ping'an on the railing of the corridor, and the two of them stared up at the sky for a moment before Zhang Shanfeng broke the silence. However, he didn't say anything beyond that, and it seemed that he was lacking the words to articulate his emotions. Chun Ping'an smiled as he said, I wasn't able to help you at all this entire time, but you haven't looked down on me for it. Isn't that what friends are for? Zhang Shanfeng scratched his head with a contemplative expression, and he felt a little better upon hearing this. Chun Ping'an saw him as a friend, and the feeling was very much mutual, so there was no need to be so pedantic in certain matters. All of a sudden, a wide smile appeared on his face as he said in a loud voice, With sideburns like halberds, the hero raises his saber against all forces of evil. Chun Ping'an smiled upon hearing this, and he knew that Zhang Shanfeng was praising Xianxia. Zhang Shanfeng then continued, The Taoist priest travels far and wide, searching for the ultimate truth. This expression was clearly dedicated to himself. Zhang Shanfeng then turned to Chun Ping'an as he said, I haven't thought of any poetry phrases to describe you, but I'm sure inspiration will strike me at some point, and when it does, It'll surely be very spectacular, I promise. Chen Ping'an was rather amused to hear this, and he didn't want to dampen Zhang Shanfeng's enthusiasm, so he could only nod in response. Chen Ping'an jumped down from the railing, rushing toward the kitchen as he yelled, "I'm going to help out in the kitchen." Zhang Shanfeng was left sitting on his own with a myriad of emotions in his heart. The sound of Su Yuanxia's laughter occasionally rang out from the main hall of the estate, and Zhang Shanfeng adopted a different posture, sitting with his back against a pillar and his arms crossed in front of his chest. The thought of that tall mountain back home sprang into his mind, and he closed his eyes as he began to hum a tune that he had made up himself while gently swaying his head back and forth in a carefree fashion. Meanwhile, Chen Ping'an was thinking back to his battle against the scholar with the Chu surname. Through that battle, he had developed a rough idea of his own martial arts prowess. Out of all of the fist techniques that Cui Chan's grandfather had taught him, the deity drumming technique was the most powerful one. Through the use of a land-shortening talisman, Chen Ping'an had ensured that the first punch struck its target. After that, all of his subsequent punches had also landed, but even so, the scholar with the Chu surname had still been able to withstand the barrage, albeit with the assistance of his armor pellet. However, 20 punches of the deity drumming technique was Chen Ping'an's current limit, and he wasn't able to throw even one more punch. Hence, if it hadn't been for the flying swords in his sword-nurturing gourd swooping in to save the day, he would have been completely at his scholar's mercy. Having been completely exhausted after using the deity drumming technique, he would have been powerless to defend himself, and the tide of the battle would have instantly turned. It most likely wouldn't have been difficult for him to get away, but victory would have been completely out of his grasp. The fact that he was able to pair his fist techniques with 1st and 15th in a relatively flawless fashion was still a very encouraging sign, but deep down, Chen Ping'an wasn't truly satisfied, feeling as if there were still something missing. As for exactly what was missing, the answer to that question couldn't have been simpler. His punches simply weren't fast and powerful enough. However, Chen Ping'an didn't dwell on this thought for long. Fist technique practice and sword practice were both things that couldn't be rushed. All he could do was take one step at a time, and eventually he would reach the heights that he yearned for. He patted the sword-nurturing gourd strapped to his waist with a smile as he said, "Thanks." 15th immediately reacted to his gesture of gratitude, flying around in the sword-nurturing gourd in an elated fashion. However, Chen Ping'an then continued, "Having said that, when you two come out in the future, can you not put on such a big show? It's not like we're engaging in a sparring match, where it would be proper etiquette to display your weapon before attacking. In a true battle against enemies, we should be more discreet and strike before the enemy even knows what's hit them. Wouldn't you agree?" 15th instantly stopped cold in its tracks, seemingly a little displeased with Chen Ping'an's constructive criticism, while first flew straight out of the sword-nurturing gourd and began wreaking havoc in Chen Ping'an's acupoint. Thankfully, this amount of pain was nothing to the current Chen Ping'an, and his smile remained unchanged as he jogged into the kitchen to help out with the cooking. Controlling one's bonded flying sword only resulted in mental exertion, and there was no need to use any true chi. However, there was a limit on the distance over which a flying sword could strike down an enemy, and that was directly correlated to the cultivation base of the swordsman. Furthermore, no shortcuts could be taken when it came to breaking through these flying sword distance bottlenecks, and the only way to do this for swordsmen was to advance in their cultivation base. A martial artist like Chen Ping'an, who had just been mistakenly praised as a sword immortal, needed his 18 stops chi channeling technique to send his true chi flowing through more acupoints in order to achieve the same thing. First's maximum radius was 100 feet, while 15th's was 80 feet. Chen Ping'an gradually approached the kitchen as these thoughts were running through his mind. How is Zhang Shanfeng a better name than Chen Ping'an? He was a little disgruntled at the thought of Zhang Shanfeng referring to his name as shallow and tacky, but a smile then suddenly appeared on his face as he thought back to how everyone had praised him as a sword immortal. The old woman was busy cooking in the kitchen, and she was rather surprised to see Chen Ping'an. According to the teachings of sages, noble gentlemen were supposed to stay out of the kitchen. 1. While the sagely teachings advised using the best possible ingredients and preparing food as meticulously as possible, that didn't mean that noble and virtuous individuals would cook in person. However, the old woman was only surprised for a moment before realizing that for someone like Chen Ping'an, who clearly traveled extensively, he would have had no choice but to cook and fend for himself. On top of that, he didn't seem to be a child from a highly educated family. Having said that, the old woman didn't think that Chen Ping'an would be able to help her much, so he assigned him with the simple tasks of cleaning the vegetables while also keeping an eye on the stove. Chen Ping'an readily accepted these chores, helping out wherever he could, and it didn't take long before the rhythmic sound of the old woman's chopping rang out in the warm kitchen. Meanwhile, Chun Ping'an was seated on a little stool, peeling some spring bamboo shoots. "What happened to your left hand, young Master Chun?" the old woman asked. Chun Ping'an took a glance down at his own bandaged left hand, then replied with a smile. "I fell over by accident and injured it a little, but it's no big deal." The old woman was happy to have someone chatting with her, and she smiled as she said, "You have to be more careful when walking on the slick ground while it's raining. This estate has already been around for a very long time, and we were in a very difficult predicament prior to this, so we had to keep a low profile. At the very most, all we did was perform some simple repairs on the yard walls. We also very rarely hang up lanterns in the night, and we didn't dare to hire any skilled artisans to come and help us for fear that we would scare them. So all the repairs on the estate were done by me, and they're only serviceable at best. Many of the bricks on the ground are quite bumpy and uneven, and if we were an affluent clan in the large cities, not only would that be an embarrassing sight for us, we would quickly become the laughingstock of the entire city if someone else were to see it. Thankfully, my masters never cared much for what people said behind their backs, and they've been willing to tolerate my shoddy repair jobs. I'm very fortunate to be serving such a pair of kind and gracious masters." The old woman spoke in a mellow and placid voice that resembled a calmly flowing river. All of the emotions that she had experienced over the course of the past century had condensed at the bottom of her heart bit by bit, and despite all of the hardships that she had to endure, she felt very blessed and fortunate. "Master Yang and his wife are very fortunate to have you," Chun Ping'an said in a quiet voice. The old woman faltered slightly upon hearing this, then turned to Chun Ping'an with a smile as she jibed. "You look like such an honest and down-to-earth kid. Where did you learn to sweet-talk others like that?" At this point, Chun Ping'an had already finished peeling all of the spring bamboo shoots and placed them into a clean bamboo basket, and he raised his head as he replied, "I'm telling the truth." The old woman looked into Chun Ping'an's clear and earnest eyes for a moment, then turned back to her cooking. Her smile had grown even wider, and she asked, "Do you have a girl that you like, young Master Chun?" The girls over in the nearby prefectural city are renowned for their good looks in our colorful garment nation. If you're not in a hurry to go anywhere, I suggest you visit a temple fair or something like that. Who knows? Perhaps you'll be able to find your future wife there. You may not be all that accomplished a martial artist, but Rouge City is just a small place with no deities or immortals, so you'll already be standing above most of your peers. If you're willing to settle permanently here, you could easily serve as a general or an admiral or something like that, and you could marry a young maiden from a good family. Doesn't that sound like a good life to lead? A shy look appeared on Chun Ping'an's face, and he didn't know how to respond. The old woman turned to take a glance at Chun Ping'an, and a knowing smile appeared on her face as she mused, "Oh, I get it. You must already have someone you like." A deep blush appeared on Chun Ping'an's face and said, "The girl that I like once asked me if I like her, and at the time, I said I didn't like her. So if I go to her now and tell her that I do like her, do you think that she'll think of me as a liar?" "That sounds like a tongue twister, young Master Chun." The old woman chuckled with an amused expression. The dish that she was cooking was simmering over the stove, so she sat down on a small stool beside the stove and smiled. "Why did you tell her that you didn't like her at the time? Were you afraid or embarrassed? Or did you think that admitting to your feelings would make the girl look down on you? So you decided to put on a stoic facade?" Chun Ping'an considered this question carefully for a moment, then gave a very candid and earnest answer. "Because I'm stupid." The old woman immediately burst into laughter, and the harsh lines of her face were softened by her amusement. "I think the girl that you like won't be mad at you. It's always a good thing for a girl to be liked, particularly by someone as earnest and pure as yourself." A slightly sullen look appeared on Chun Ping'an's face as he set down the basketful of spring bamboo shoots onto the counter beside the stove, then said, "But she once told me that she only likes powerful sword immortals." The old woman held back the urge to laugh as she said, "Well, that really is a tall order for you. A sword immortal has to be at least at the 6th tier. My young master was a prodigious cultivator, yet even back when he was cultivating in Divine Edict sect, he wasn't able to reach the middle 5 tiers. I have a suggestion for you, young Master Chun. I think you should negotiate with the girl that you like to see if she can lower her standards a little. For example, instead of a 6th tier swordsman, how about she accepts a 4th or 5th tier swordsman instead? All swordsmen are generally revered and admired everywhere, and a 4th or 5th tier swordsman is already considered to be very remarkable by the vast majority of people." Chun Ping'an wanted to say something, but decided against it in the end. By powerful sword immortal, Ning Yao definitely meant one that was at least at the 12th tier, Even if she was willing to lower her standards a little for him, he would still most likely have to be on par with the likes of Wei Jin. Chen Ping'an heaved a faint sigh, then suddenly said, "The food's ready." The old woman hurriedly stood up and lifted the lid of the pot, and it didn't take long before a delicious dish that excelled in appearance, aroma, and flavor was scooped out onto a plate. Chen Ping'an was instructed to carry the dish to the main hall, and he was also told that he didn't have to come back to the kitchen after delivering the dish. However, Chen Ping'an quickly rushed back after setting the dish down on the table in the main hall, and in response to the old woman's angry facade, Chen Ping'an smiled as he explained, "I'm here for some wine." Master Yang agreed to spare me some wine. Chen Ping'an removed the wine gourd from his waist as a bright smile appeared on his face, and he concluded, "And he said that I can take as much as I want." The old woman pulled a wine ladle out of a nearby cabinet, then smiled as she pointed at the several large jars of wine in the corner of the kitchen as she said, "Take an unopened jar of wine for everyone to share. There's a jar that's already been opened over there, and it's still about halfway full. You can use that to fill your wine gourd, and it should definitely be enough." After that, the old woman paid no further heed to Chen Ping'an as she continued cooking. A short while later, Chen Ping'an informed her that he was leaving, then departed from the kitchen with a jar of wine in his hands. The woman turned to glance at the red wine gourd strapped to Chen Ping'an's waist with a smile on her face. The gourd was rather weathered and unremarkable in appearance, and the old woman was rather amused that Chen Ping'an was already such an avid drinker at such a young age. At the same time, she couldn't help but wonder if this gourd of wine would be drunk for celebration or to drown his sorrows once he met the girl that he liked. Of course, she was rooting for him and hoping that his feelings would be reciprocated by the girl of his heart, as was the case for her masters. At this moment, there was a joyous and harmonious atmosphere in the main hall. Yang Huang and Zhu Jing were seated on the left-hand side of the table, while Su Yuanxia was sitting at the head of the table. Su Yuanxia was a very direct and straightforward man, so he couldn't be bothered to turn down this arrangement. Meanwhile, Zhang Shanfeng was seated on the right-hand side, and after the dishes and wine were carried to the table by Chen Ping'an, everyone began drinking to their heart's content. In a rather comical sight to behold, Zhu Jing's roots snaked all the way from the boudoir into the main hall, and in order to not spoil everyone's appetite, she had put on a thick veil to conceal her face. Earlier, Su Yuanxia had already asked whether there were any immortal techniques that could be used to help the poor woman recover her original appearance. But Yang Huang had shaken his head with a wry smile in response before giving Su Yuanxia a detailed explanation for the reasons involved. As it turned out, the combination of divine edict sex inscription talismans, the secret technique that had been used to resurrect Zhu Jing, and the wood core of ancient Elm Nation's ancestral elm tree had resulted in a set of very complex circumstances to navigate. The crux of the matter was that the formation in the estate and the wood core of the ancestral elm tree had fused as one and couldn't be moved. As for this location, it was a massive unmarked grave with a radius of hundreds of kilometers. 200 years ago, a horrific famine had befallen Colorful Garment Nation, and over 100,000 people had perished as a result. Most of them had been buried haphazardly around the area, and all of the past emperors of Colorful Garment Nation since then had hoped to alter the feng shui of this place. There was one occasion when a master Taoist priest at the Sea Observation Tier had been passing through Colorful Garment Nation, and the emperor at the time had requested an audience with the Sea Observation Tier Taoist priest, imploring him to alter the fortunes of the area. Extensive remedial measures were thus taken. Even just the 2 heavenly worship ceremonies that had been carried out cost close to 1,000,000 taels of silver. However, the effects only lasted a few years before the area reverted back to a horrific hellscape that was rife with wandering spirits and sinister energies, and it seemed that even the gods would have been powerless to change anything. Yang Huang had chosen this place for its feng shui, and it was keeping Zhu Jing alive, but it was no different from drinking seawater to quench one's thirst. Eventually, there would come a day when she would become an evil spirit. Yang Huang was very candid about this inevitable eventuality, and Zhu Jing had also accepted her fate. The 2 of them had already made an agreement that when that day arrived, they would both put an end to their own lives so that they didn't become a menace to the people in the area. The wood core of the ancestral elm tree was actually a very pure object, but at the time, Yang Huang had been desperate to save Zhu Jing's soul, and the drastic measures that he had taken had resulted in her soul progressively becoming more and more tainted. If she could absorb the spiritual energy of a pure and untainted land over a prolonged period of time, then she could have been able to recover her spirituality and even reciprocate the fortune of the land, becoming an existence similar to the illegitimate mountain god. The only difference was that due to the ancestral elm tree, her divine nature would have been completely different from the illegitimate mountain god. She would have served to benefit the area, while that illegitimate mountain god could only spoil and taint the land even further. In the end, Yang Huang mused that in 30 years at most, he and Zhuijing would no longer be around, so he urged Su Yuanxia, Zhang Shanfeng, and Chen Pingyan to come and visit as frequently as possible before time was up for them. At the very least, they would have a clean place to stay, and he and Zhuijing would certainly enjoy the company and pleasant conversation. This was a matter that concerned the enormous fortune of the entire area in a radius of hundreds of kilometers. So neither Su Yuanxia nor Zhang Shanfeng were able to think of any feasible solutions. Only qi refiners who had reached the 10th tier had the power to influence the fortune of the land. It was an unspoken rule that all 10th tier qi refiners could refer to themselves as sages. Initially, this was a title of reverence coined by mortal empires. Immortals of the upper 5 tiers were simply far too rare, while 10th tier cultivators had to occupy a blessed land with abundant spiritual energy and cultivate for extensive periods of time in order to make a breakthrough. Occasionally, they would interact with mortal emperors and other important figures of the mortal world, and over time, 10th tier Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist qi refiners all became colloquially known as sages. While it was true that Chen Pingyan had become an avid drinker, he never drank very much in any single sitting. In contrast, Su Yuanxia preferred to eat and drink to his heart's content whenever the opportunity arose. As for Zhang Shanfeng, his tolerance for alcohol was even inferior to Chen Pingyan's, yet he was very susceptible to persuasion. It didn't take much convincing from Yang Huang and Su Yuanxia for him to down one bowl of wine after another. In the end, Chen Pingyan only dared to pour very small amounts of wine for him at a time. Yet even so, it still didn't take long before he was completely inebriated, stumbling around with rosy cheeks and heavy-lidded eyes. In his drunken state, he had become a lot louder, and he was happily discussing things that he had seen during his travels with Su Yuanxia, while also reciting poetry with Yang Huang. The old woman would periodically bring in new dishes, and with one jar of wine emptied, she immediately brought in another one. It was a very joyous occasion for everyone present, yet right as the second jar of wine was about to run dry, an anguished wail suddenly rang out. "Where have you gone, Brother Chu? Don't leave me here on my own. Taoist priest Zhang, young Master Chen, why are you two also nowhere to be seen? Have you been eaten by demons and spirits? Curse you, abhorrent demons. If you're going to eat us, then eat all of us together. Don't save me for last." The old woman set down a dish onto the table, and she was just about to go to the scholar with the Lu surname and explain to him what had happened. But Chen Pingyan hurriedly rose to his feet and volunteered to go in her stead. The old woman quickly decided that this was for the best. After all, if she were to go, the cowardly scholar would most likely be so frightened that he would fall unconscious. Before long, the scholar with the Lu surname was led to the main hall by Chen Pingyan. His legs were trembling, while his lips had turned blue, but he was slightly reassured at the sight of Su Yuanxia. However, he then spotted the terrifying tree roots snaking into the main hall from the boudoir, and his eyes instantly rolled back into his head. Right before he fell unconscious, Chen Pingyan tightened his grip around the scholar's arm, sending a sharp jolt of pain running through his arm that snapped him back to his senses. The scholar was on the verge of tears as he turned to Chen Pingyan and complained, "Just let me faint!" An exasperated look appeared on Chen Pingyan's face as he said, "If you're too scared to stay sober, then have some wine. If you drink yourself to death, then so be it. Surely you have at least that much courage." "Can I refuse?" the scholar asked with a pitiful expression. "No," Chen Pingyan replied in a stern voice. The scholar took a careful glance at Chen Pingyan's face, and he could tell that Chen Pingyan was serious, so he could only heave a forlorn sigh before declaring, "Fine, if you want me to drink, then that's what I'll do. Even if this wine is going to kill me, it's still wine." After taking a seat at the table, the scholar with the Lu surname didn't dare to look at anyone, and all he did was drink in silence. Su Yuanxia smiled as he asked, "How did you end up becoming friends with that tree spirit? I can't believe you traveled all the way here with him. Now that I think about it, you're very blessed to have survived to this point and be drinking with us right now. Judging from your attire, you must be from quite an affluent clan of colorful garment nation, right? My father is the prefectural overseer of the Blusher Prefecture, but we're not a wealthy clan at all." The scholar with the Lu surname replied in a trembling voice. An exasperated look appeared on Su Yuanxia's face. "What kind of response is that? Do I look like some type of bandit or robber to you?" The scholar took a glance up at Su Yuanxia, and he couldn't help but think to himself that Su Yuanxia couldn't have looked more like a bandit in his eyes. Xianxia didn't intimidate the scholar any further as he suddenly turned to Yang Huang with a slightly concerned expression. Brother Yang, is that old Taoist priest really going to take care of the illegitimate mountain god? I'm worried that he may spare the illegitimate mountain god as a way to get back at you. Yang Huang shook his head as he smiled and replied, seeing as Senior Aunt Fu was involved in this matter, Divine Edict sect would be sure to keep close tabs on how this matter has been resolved. On top of that, all external disciples that are sent out of the sect for training have to undergo a final assessment that's extremely strict and meticulous, so Zhao Lu won't be able to just do whatever he pleases. Yang Huang's smile then faded as he continued. What I'm worried about right now is that the illegitimate mountain god could have some backers among the local authorities. Given Zhao Lu's sneaky and conniving nature, I could easily see him discussing this matter with some high-ranking officials of the prefecture. On the surface, it would be a discussion, but in reality, they would be working together to hatch a scheme. If Zhao Lu managed to convince the Imperial Court and Ministry of Rights of Colorful Garment Nation to keep that illegal temple or even instate the illegitimate mountain god as an official one, then things could become very grim. The gods of the 5 mountains of Colorful Garment Nation can't compare with those from larger nations, only possessing the cultivation base of a 6th-tier chi refiner, and they can even wield sea observation tier power when in their own territory. That mountain god may be an illegitimate one, but he still managed to attain a godly body, and if Zhao Lu managed to convince the Imperial Court of Colorful Garment Nation to assign him as the official mountain god, then there's a chance that he could attain cave abode tier power. Any words of advice from an immortal from Divine Edict sect would undoubtedly be taken very seriously by the Emperor of Colorful Garment Nation. After hearing what Yang Huang had to say, Xianxia, Zhang Shanfeng, and Chen Pingyan turned to the scholar with the Lu surname in unison. The scholar was looking completely befuddled. He had no idea what concepts like gods of the 5 mountains, illegitimate mountain gods, the cave abode tier, and the sea observation tier were. In the end, he said in a timid voice, my father is only a 4th-rank prefectural overseer. I don't think he's ever even heard of things like mountain gods before, so he won't be able to help at all. Xianxia smiled as he said, don't worry, we're not expecting your father to help in this matter. All we need to ensure is that he doesn't do the opposite of helping. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll accompany you back to the rough prefectural city to meet your father. At the very least, we have to get there before Zhao Lu does. I'm sure that once Zhao Lu sees me at the prefectural overseer's office, he'll know not to go through with any schemes that he could be plotting. If he does decide to go through with it anyway, he'll have to worry about me going to Divine Edict sect to report his actions, and you can bet that I'll be doing just that. I'll kick down the gate of the sect or do whatever it takes to attract the attention of the sect's higher-ups and have them uphold justice. Yang Huang immediately rose to his feet and cupped his fist toward Xianxia in a grateful salute. You have my thanks, Brother Su. A peculiar look appeared on Xianxia's face, and he took a sip of wine as he grumbled, what do you mean by Brother Su? You're so old that you could be my great-grandfather. Yang Huang burst into laughter as he replied, age is not something that can get in the way of friendship. Even Zhuojing began to chuckle to herself upon hearing this exchange. The scholar with the Lu surname had finally become a little more relaxed after having some wine to drink, only to immediately become as pale as a sheet once again upon hearing Zhuojing's haunting laughter. That night, Zhang Shanfeng had way too much to drink, while the scholar by the name of Lu Gaohua didn't dare to drink to his heart's content for fear of passing out and never waking up again. In the end, the 4 of them stayed in the same section of the estate, with Chen Pingyan and Zhang Shanfeng staying in adjacent rooms, while the scholar with the Lu surname became neighbors with Xianxia. An uneventful night passed by. Early in the morning, Zhang Shanfeng got out of bed and opened the door to find that Chen Pingyan was already practicing his walking meditation in the yard outside. Compared with back when they had first met, it seemed that his walking meditation was becoming slower and slower. The 4 of them departed after having the breakfast prepared by the old woman. It was a bright and sunny day, and Yang Huang and Zhuojing were rather averse to being exposed to the sun, so the 2 of them waved farewell at everyone from the boudoir. Xianxia yawned lazily as he looked up at the bright sun through narrowed eyes and remarked, it's a brand new day. Zhang Shanfeng was engaged in a spirited conversation with the scholar with the Lu surname about the customs and traditions of the Blusher prefecture, and the latter was in far higher spirits after leaving the estate. It was as if he had suddenly sprung back to life, and he was eagerly sharing his knowledge with Zhang Shanfeng. Upon making his way to the front gate, Chen Pingyan suddenly turned around and said to the old woman, if you ever encounter any trouble, you can send a letter to Dragon Spring County, which is situated in the northernmost region of the Great Li Empire. Address the letter to a person called Wei Bo on Cloud Drape Mountain, and tell him that Brother Yang Huang is a friend of mine, and that I owe him a lot of wine. The old woman nodded in response with a smile on her face. She naturally wasn't taking this seriously, but she didn't turn Chen Ping'an down, either. Some acts of kindness were like light rain falling into the sea. They didn't make much of a difference, but there was no reason to refuse them. Chen Ping'an extended a hand forward, offering 7 or 8 snowflake coins to the old woman as he said, "The Great Li Empire is really far away from colorful garment nation, so you'll need this money to post the letter." Yang Huang had already exhausted all of his wealth to build this estate, and as a result, the master and servant trio was forced to live an extremely frugal lifestyle, to the point that they had to brew their own wine, and all of the ingredients for the dishes that were cooked had been picked by the old woman from far away. The old woman hesitated momentarily, but ultimately decided to accept the snowflake coins. While it was true that sending a letter to the Great Li Empire at the northernmost tip of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent was going to cost a lot of money, it definitely didn't require 7 snowflake coins. However, it was only a small handful of coins, and it was just the right amount, not too much and not too little. It felt like turning down the coins would have been a rather cold gesture and perhaps even a little rude. And even if she did accept the coins, it wasn't like she would be owing him a huge favor. With that in mind, a series of mixed emotions welled up in the old woman's heart. Despite his young age, Chen Ping'an was already able to take such a considerate and nuanced approach when it came to treating others, and the old woman couldn't help but wonder just how much hardship he had to endure to have made him so mature beyond his years. Zhang Shanfeng beckoned to Chen Ping'an with a smile as he urged, "Come on, Chen Ping'an. It's time to go." Chen Ping'an gave Zhang Shanfeng an affirmative response, then bade farewell to the old woman. After rushing away a few steps, however, he suddenly turned back to face the boudoir and yelled, "I read in a book that those who are connected by love will never be apart." Over at the boudoir, Yang Huang and Zhuijing exchanged a smile, and they felt as if all of the suffering that they had been forced to endure up to this point had been worth it. Chen Ping'an continued to jog backward as he waved farewell to the old woman again. "The spring bamboo shoot and meat stir-fry that you cooked last night was delicious. I'll definitely be visiting again." The old woman stood at the entrance of the estate with a warm smile on her face, and she heaved a faint sigh at the sight of the departing Chen Ping'an. As the group arrived at the manor of the Blusher prefectural overseer, he was in the process of attending to his daily duties in the official hall. Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng were seated in the guest hall, in which the furnishings were quite simple, yet still elegant and refined. The two were sipping on some tea that had brought to them by a maidservant, while Lu Gaohua led Chen Ping'an to his father's study, doing so in a very sneaky fashion as Chen Ping'an had asked him for a geomancy map of the Blusher prefecture, and it had to be one with an imperial court seal stamped on it. Lu Gaohua didn't know why Chen Ping'an had made such a request, but he thought back to how he had managed to leave the estate alive, and how he had not only witnessed an incarnated spirit but even sat down at the same table and shared a drink with her. As soon as this thought sprang into his mind, his heart was immediately filled with pride, and he agreed to help Chen Ping'an sneak out a geomancy map. Chen Ping'an had given him 50 taels of silver for his troubles, and Lu Gaohua's initial thought was to refuse as bringing money into the matter would be hurtful to their friendship. However, as soon as he saw the 50 taels of silver, he immediately changed his mind, thinking to himself that they most likely weren't ever going to meet each other again anyway, so it didn't really matter whether their friendship remained intact or not. Lu Gaohua led Chen Ping'an to the study, sneaking around like the thief the entire time, and after closing the door, he rummaged through the chests and cabinets for a long while before finally pulling out an old scroll, which was an antiquated geomancy map of the Blusher prefecture. But this one was only a backup copy. When it came to geomancy maps that were drawn by the Ministry of Astronomy, there were always 2 official maps, one of which was hung up in the office of the local authorities, while the other was given to the local general for safekeeping purposes, and the backup copy was always left somewhere to gather dust. After examining the map to confirm that it was what he was looking for, Chen Ping'an nodded as he declared, "This is it." He had spent 50 taels of silver to buy a very slim possibility. Mr. Qi had once said to him that if he ever came across a map that he liked, then he could bring out his mountain and water seals and stamp them onto the map without the need for any ink paste. After asking Lu Gaohua where Yang Huang's estate was situated on the map, he made up an excuse to get Lu Gaohua to go to the bookshelf and pick out a few travel journals. While Lu Gaohua's back was turned, Chen Ping'an instantly pulled his mountain and water seals out of his pocket treasure. The inscriptions on the seals had been personally carved out by Qi Jingchun, and the seals were crafted from the finest snake gall pebbles of Jewel's small world. Chen Ping'an breathed onto the pair of seals momentarily, then pressed them down onto the spot where the estate was situated on the map. However, nothing seemed to happen, and Chen Ping'an could only roll up the map before tucking it under his arm as he turned to Lu Gaohua and said, All right, let's get out of here. If your father catches us, then you'll have to deal with him on your own. I already paid you for this, so if you end up being beaten by your father, you'll still have silver to spare after paying your medical bill. Lu Gaohua picked out a couple of books at random and tossed them at Chen Ping'an, following which the two of them left the study together. Chen Ping'an heaved an internal sigh, thinking to himself that his actions had most likely been futile. Then again, he hadn't harbored any high hopes that this would work anyway. How could he possibly reverse the fortune of an entire area spanning a radius of several hundred kilometers just by stamping a seal down onto a map? It wasn't like he was a god. However, there was one thing that Chen Ping'an had failed to take into account. He was certainly no god himself, but the man who had bestowed those seals upon him had been a god among gods. All of a sudden, all of the filth and sinister energies within a radius of several hundred kilometers receded, restoring the purity of the land. The mountain god temple of the illegitimate mountain god instantly collapsed, while the illegitimate mountain god's godly body was also destroyed. As it turned out, Zhao Luan had indeed spared him, and he had even met with the illegitimate mountain god in secret to tell him how to proceed from here onward. The illegitimate mountain god had been ecstatic, thinking that his fortunes were about to be reversed, that he wasn't just going to be a lowly illegitimate mountain god anymore. Instead, he was going to ascend to the position of a formal god with the assistance of an immortal from Divine Edict sect. Hence, right up to the instant that his godly body was destroyed, he still had no idea what had happened, and he was seated on his altar with a dazed expression as he faded into nothingness. Meanwhile, Zhao Lu was departing from the area with his juniors, and he instantly sensed what had just taken place. A stunned look appeared on his face. Could it be that the Golden Boy personally intervened in this matter? It can't be. Surely even the Golden Boy can't influence the fortune of the land from so far away. The other Divine Edict sect juniors were feeling very concerned and uneasy in the wake of this unexpected turn of events. But the little boy had lowered his head to conceal the smile that had appeared on his face. I fucking knew it. I knew that guy was an old bastard that had lived for centuries. He's definitely the one that was responsible for all of this. Haha, once I get back to the sect, I'm definitely boasting to my master, telling him that I saw an immortal of the upper 5 tiers. Over at the boudoir, Yang Huang sprang onto the rooftop as quickly as he could, paying no heed to the scorching pain of sunlight on his skin. He looked around to find that the entire surrounding area was thriving with vitality, and that spiritual energy was converging from all directions. A stunned and ecstatic look appeared on his face. As for Zhu Jing, she had plunged straight through the roof, allowing her hideous body beneath her dress to be exposed under the light of the sun. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in 100 years, she inhaled a lungful of clean and fresh air that made her feel refreshed and reinvigorated. Tears of excitement began to well up in Yang Huang's eyes as he said, "A sage must have intervened to help us. Perhaps Senior Aunt Fu's appearance alerted a certain powerful figure of Divine Edict sect to our situation, and they decided to perform this miracle for us out of the boundless kindness and generosity of their heart. In any case, this is a fantastic development. I didn't even dare to dream that something would ever happen." Yang Huang's voice began to choke up as he spoke, and he suddenly fell to his knees, kowtowing thrice in all 4 directions. Zhu Jing was unable to kneel, so she could only extend deep bows of gratitude. The old woman also kowtowed to the heavens and the earth. She had almost never touched any alcohol in her life, yet she was struck by the sudden urge to pour herself a bowl of wine. She didn't enjoy the taste, but who cared? This was an occasion worthy of rapturous celebration, and it would be an injustice to the occasion not to have some wine. With that in mind, she made her way into the corner of the kitchen, and with a bowl in one hand, she took the wine ladle with the other, extending it into an already open jar of wine. An instant later, she was rooted to the spot. Why is there so little wine left? Her brows furrowed slightly with befuddlement. Then her skin began to crawl. She hurriedly set down the bowl and the ladle, then abruptly standing back upright as she murmured to herself, "How is this possible?" She wiped away the sweat that had beaded up on her forehead, following which a smile suddenly appeared on her face as she poured out what little remained of the wine in the jar into her bowl. After that, she made her way out of the kitchen and sat down onto a bench in the corridor, silently staring into the distance as she took some small sips of wine. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace and serenity. On a day just as bright and sunny as this one, Chen Ping'an had rushed away with his wooden box on his back and a radiant smile on his face as he waved farewell to her. There was a small red gourd strapped to his waist. A gourd, she now realized, filled to the brim with wine. So he's a young alcoholic sword immortal. An amused smile appeared on the old woman's face as she thought to herself, he's such a fantastic young boy. The girl that he likes must be really exceptional as well. And the prefectural overseer's residence in Blusher Prefecture. After stealing a backup prefectural geomantic map from his father, the family thief Lu Gaohua started to feel a little guilty and nervous. He felt like the 50 taels of silver were like a hot potato, so he wanted to do something to rectify this situation somewhat. Thus, he left Su Yuanxia and the others in the guest hall and ran to his father's work office by himself. He told his father that he had met immortals from the books during his travels, and one of them was a big-bearded saber-wielding man who was a renowned and gallant individual in the cultivation world. In fact, even the most powerful person in the prefecture might not be able to withstand 3 strikes from this man. As such, they definitely couldn't neglect him and make him feel unwelcome. There was also a heavenly master from Mount Longhu, and he had a peach with sword on his back and possessed profound knowledge. Slaying demons and subduing fiends was like child's play to him. Finally, there was a young boy with the surname Chen who was even more incredible. Even though he looked young, he was definitely 80 or 90 years old already. Indeed, he simply appeared young because achieving success in cultivation would allow one to obtain a youthful appearance. Prefectural Overseer Lu was slightly skeptical of his son's lavish and exaggerated praise of these 3 guests. With a hint of nervousness in his mind, he brought an experienced and knowledgeable aide with him and went to the guest hall to meet these esteemed guests. However, he was deeply disappointed by what he saw. The prefectural overseer hadn't seen many immortals or ghosts before, but his judgment of people was genuinely very good. After greeting his guests, he sat down to drink a cup of tea with them. However, it was clear that he was lacking interest. After telling Lu Gaohua to look after the 3 esteemed guests, he found an excuse to return to his office. While walking back to his office, prefectural overseer Lu shook his head and commented, "Gallant martial artist, heavenly master, they fail to live up to these titles. Yet they've come to my residence to cheat me of food, shelter, and wealth. How audacious. If they dare to push their luck, then I'll make sure to throw them into jail and have them eat their fill of jail food." The old aide chuckled and said in a quiet voice, "They're not so incapable that they'll stoop to the level of cheating us of food and shelter. I don't know about the young Taoist priest or the young boy with the swords, but that saber-wielding man does indeed possess some genuine skills. The guards in the residence are definitely no match for him. Lord Lu, you're aware that I once traveled around the world for 20-odd years before starting my work here. I've come across countless well-renowned grandmasters in the cultivation world, and placed in the southern region of our colorful garment nation, all of them can be considered top-notch elites. In terms of his aura and disposition alone, that big-bearded man is no inferior to these people. His eyes possess an intense glint, and his aura feels stern and forbidding." Prefectural Overseer Lu nodded and replied, "That's a fair analysis. Lord Lu, think about it. The general who's responsible for overseeing our prefecture is publicly regarded as a 4th-tier superior grandmaster. We saw him from a distance during that feast back then, and at the time we felt like he had a natural sense of authority even when he was simply drinking or casually chatting with others. We felt like he was extremely intimidating. Now, carefully think back to our meeting with Su Yuanxia just then. Did he possess a similar aura?" The old aide asked in a quiet voice. Prefectural Overseer Lu frowned and said, "By the sounds of it, you want us to build a good relationship with him and win him over? However, I've heard that when dealing with people from the cultivation world, one can only be considered generous if they offer 1,000 taels of silver. If one only offers a few taels of silver as payment, then this will be seen as an act of humiliation instead of generosity. This will offend those reckless brutes from the cultivation world. However, I've always been upright and uncorrupted, so I don't have any spare money to offer them. What should I do? Perhaps I have to borrow money from those wealthy people in the prefectural city." A hint of displeasure appeared on his face, and he continued, "If this relationship is predicated on the stench of copper coins, then so be it if I give it a pass." In reality, scholars, especially those who were officials in the imperial court, still looked down on martial artists in the cultivation world. The old aide sighed in his mind. This was a relationship from the cultivation world that had come running to their door, yet prefectural overseer Lu was still unable to grab this opportunity with both hands. It was no wonder that he was only a 4th-rank official even though his essays and assessments were so brilliant. He couldn't blame anyone else for this. Prefectural Overseer Lu's imperial examiner was also a duke and senior official in the imperial court of colorful garment nation, and if he were the prefectural overseer instead, then he would do everything in his ability to build this relationship, even if it meant borrowing money and selling his possessions. Supposing that the big-bearded martial artist was a third-tier lesser grandmaster, then many things could be done in the shadows once their relationship reached a certain level. Moreover, there was always give and take when it came to relationships, so how could one possibly hope to take without giving? It wasn't right for officials to always beg others for help. In any case, Prefectural Overseer Lu simply needed to build a relationship with the wealthy clans in the prefectural city and borrow a few hundred taels of silver from them. Was this truly so difficult and embarrassing? No, of course not. In fact, this was the Prefectural Overseer giving them face. However, Prefectural Overseer Lu didn't like hearing these things, especially since he felt like these beliefs were a stain on the decorum of scholars. After making the same mistake once or twice, the old aide understood what should be said and what shouldn't be said. Upon thinking of this, the old aide couldn't help but feel slightly disheartened. The imperial court was full of complicated relationships and interests, and was the cultivation world not the same? Before concealing his identity and leaving the cultivation world, the old aide was once a trusted strategist for an alliance leader in the southern regions of Colorful Garment Nation. There were times when revenge was exacted swiftly and debts of gratitude were repaid earnestly, but it was more often the case that relationships would be complicated and full of small nuances. So what if one started out gallant and full of enthusiasm? All it took was a few years to wear them out. Indeed, just how proud and mighty had the alliance leader been back then. Yet, in the end, did he not also lose his wife, children, and wealth? Lu Gaohua was left in a fairly awkward position after his father came and left in a lukewarm manner. Not only that, but the prefectural residence was so stingy that it was unable to even offer a few guest rooms to the 3 guests. In the end, Xianxia asked Lu Gaohua to bring them to the nearest inn to rest. The big-bearded martial artist also asked him to immediately notify them if the old Taoist priest from Divine Edict sect entered the residence of the prefectural overseer. Lu Gaohua nodded and agreed to these requests. Thanks to its good location and time-honored reputation, the inn was bustling with people and business. Fortunately, the face of the prefectural overseer's son was still worth some money. The inn forcibly found a few rooms for them, and it didn't dare to wantonly raise the price either. Lu Gaohua accepted all of this without a second thought, and he was completely oblivious to the fact that the owner of the inn was painfully parting with a good sum of money by doing this. Xianxia was quite amused by this, and even the young Taoist priest Zhang Shanfeng shook his head upon seeing this. Interacting with others and dealing with social matters also required sufficient knowledge. This knowledge was seldom taught in the classics written by the sages, but it could be observed and learned in the cultivation world. Thus, Chun Pingyan observed these things and committed them to memory. In reality, this kind of knowledge also existed in Clay Vase Alley, Peach Blossom Tavern, and all of the other mortal streets and alleys in the world. Chun Pingyan and the others casually chatted in Xianxia's room. As they chatted, they naturally started to talk about their trip to the old residence and the value of Zhang Shanfeng's divine movement talisman. Xianxia asked the young Taoist priest how much these talismans cost, and after learning of their exorbitant value, he immediately felt a little indebted to the young Taoist priest from complete Reed Continent. He smiled and said that they definitely needed to obtain some rewards the next time they went to slay demons and vanquish fiends. Even though Zhang Shanfeng was impoverished and tired of his less-than-ideal situation, he didn't blame the heavens or other people at all. Xianxia was quite impressed by this. After all, he understood how important it was for cultivators to accumulate wealth. Having traveled far and wide himself, Xianxia was well aware of the rules and cultivation methods of some immortal forces in the mountains. When it came to the cultivation of qi refiners, what they cultivated was the mind, the body, and also gold and silver. If the young Taoist priest failed to break free from his cycle of poverty, then it would definitely be very difficult for him to advance to higher tiers. Regardless of how impressive his mindset was, his achievements would be limited by his lack of wealth and resources. While having this casual conversation with Xianxia and Zhang Shanfeng, Chun Pingyan was finally able to properly learn about the lower 5 tiers for the first time. When returning to the small town from Great Sui Nation with his student, Cui Chan, Chun Pingyan had been curious about this because Lin Shui had already become half an immortal from the mountains. During a rare casual chat with Cui Chan, Chun Pingyan had asked him about matters regarding cultivation and qi refining. However, the young Cui Chan had rolled his eyes and snickered. Lower 5 tiers? They're all trash. How boring is it to talk about these things? This is an insult to teacher's lofty and elegant nature. Teacher, why don't we talk about the upper 5 tiers? Thinking back to the past, your student was also at the 12th tier. Chun Pingyan's impression of Cui Chan had been extremely bad at the time, so he hadn't been willing to listen to his boastful and exaggerated descriptions. As such, he had stood up and walked away to practice standing meditation. Thinking about this now, had his actions hurt Cui Chan's sense of dignity? After all, Cui Chan had once been a 12th-tier immortal, and he had even played Go in the iridescent clouds with the city lord of White Emperor City. Chun Ping'an scratched his head before drinking a sip of tea. Right now, he was regretting his decision to attach the banknotes worth 2,000 taels of silver to the letter addressed to Cui Dongshan. It was improper to be so polite to his student who had once been an immortal. Wasn't his action an insult to Cui Dongshan? The lower 5 tiers for chi refiners were referred to as the mountain ascending 5 tiers, the copper skin tier, the grassroot tier, the willow tendon tier, the bone chi tier, and the furnace molding tier. Among these 5 tiers, the first 4 were focused on cultivating one's flesh. Even though these were cultivation tiers for chi refiners, they were in fact nurturing a tough physique during these earlier tiers. This was very important as well. The reason for this was simple. If a person were viewed as a bowl, then refining a pound of chi would be useless if the bowl could only hold 8 ounces. The excess chi would become completely meaningless. The final cultivation tier, the furnace molding tier, was a stage where one integrated everything together and forged their cultivation into a furnace. This was a stage where one's body, which could be viewed as one's chi refining tool, reached a stage of great accomplishment. In other words, they could officially ascend the mountains. Yang Huang, the ghost from the ancient residence, had mentioned the willow tendon tier many times before, and he described this as the cultivator trapping tier. Because of this, the big-bearded martial artist especially explained this to Chun Ping'an again. He had spoken with eagerness and relish, and his words were filled with a pure martial artist's ridicule toward immortals from the mountains. This made Chun Ping'an, who was coincidentally stuck at the 3rd tier, feel extremely helpless. There was once an astonishingly talented cultivator with the surname Lu. Just by tempering his tendons alone, he was able to directly advance to the upper 5 tiers and obtain a supreme immortal body. Could be said that this was an incredible feat with no precedent. In fact, it's because of this that the 3rd tier for chi refiners is called the willow tendon tier. However, this tier is called the cultivator trapping tier. This is because many cultivators who yearn to take shortcuts go astray and walk down dead ends based on the incomplete secret cultivation texts left by that talented cultivator. They become trapped in this tier for far too long, and this eventually delays them and inhibits them for life. The big-bearded martial artist was only drinking tea, but he appeared just as hearty as if he were drinking wine. There was derision in his voice as he continued, "We martial artists are always looked down on by cultivators from the mountains, but there is one area where we're definitely superior to those chi refiners. That is, we take solid and steady steps, and we don't take any random or jumbled shortcuts. We're far more grounded than chi refiners." Thus, the willow tendon tier has trapped countless young cultivators who are putting their faith in shortcuts and luck. Moreover, when considering chi refiners at the lower 5 tiers, they have zero advantage over pure martial artists at the 3rd tier unless they're militarian cultivators or sword cultivators. As the only chi refiner present, the young Taoist priest grumbled in annoyance. Then why don't we compare martial artists at the 3 chi tempering tiers? One to chi refiners at the middle 5 tiers? We chi refiners will definitely be more likely to win. Su Yuanxia chuckled and said, "Let's stick to comparing cultivators at the same cultivation level. Chi refiners at the 9th tier, the golden core tier, are pretty impressive, aren't they? But what if they come across pure martial artists at the mountain summit tier? Will a group of 10th tier chi refiners dare to cause trouble in front of the great Li Empire's Song Chongjing? Song Chongjing is this among the pure martial artists in Eastern treasured vile continent." The big-bearded martial artist raised his thumb. He was unwilling to put his thumb down as he loudly praised. These kinds of martial artists are genuine heroes in the world. They exist outside the mountains, yet they can peer down on those from the mountains. It's such a great shame that I can't see him in person. Otherwise, I'll shamelessly make a toast with him no matter what. There was a strange expression on Chun Ping'an's face. Wasn't Song Chongjing the uncle of Song Jisun? He had visited Clay Vase Alley once before, and Chun Ping'an had even crossed paths with him. In any case, there were a few other pure martial artists in the small town who possessed similar cultivation bases to Song Chongjing. There was Li Huai's father, and there was also Cui Chan's grandfather. Chun Ping'an lowered his head and quietly took a sip of tea. Afterward, the 3 of them walked down to the ground floor of the inn to eat. People were having spirited discussions while eating and drinking, and as it turned out, an old immortal was about to bless Blusher Prefecture with his presence. His mystical abilities were profound and unpredictable. Immortals described in books could transform beings into soldiers, Yet this old immortal was someone who could transform pieces of paper into beautiful women. After the pieces of yellow paper landed on the ground, they would transform into beautiful women of shapely figures and demeanor who appeared no different from real people. They could sing and dance, and they could also engage in conversations with no issues. While traveling south through colorful Garment Nation, the old immortal had already impressed many officials and nobles on the way. Thus, even though the old immortal was yet to arrive in this prefectural city that was renowned for its beautiful women, people were already craning their necks and eagerly awaiting his arrival. The men were keen to see those pieces of paper transforming into all kinds of beautiful women, and they wanted to see whether these women truly possessed a unique charm. Meanwhile, the beautiful women in the prefectural city started to feel competitive. After all, how could a thin sheet of paper be more beautiful than them? Chun Pingyan had little interest in this. However, the big-bearded martial artist and the young Taoist priest were both extremely eager, and they said that they definitely had to go over to check this out. The former was filled with sincerity as he said that the old immortal was perhaps a demon or evil spirit who was wearing human skin. The latter nodded earnestly and said that they definitely couldn't allow demons or evil spirits to enchant and bewitch others. Looking at the two people who were speaking in a righteous manner, Chun Pingyan thought to himself, "Can the two of you wipe away your drool before speaking? You just want to look at some beautiful women, don't you? Just say it straight if that's the case. I'm not going to laugh at you guys or anything. At the end of the day, this is because they haven't seen a genuinely beautiful girl before." Chun Pingyan was very confident regarding this. This was because he felt like he had already seen the most beautiful girl in the world. Her eyebrows were like the distant mountains. A small pond was newly dug out behind the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain, and the water was extremely limpid and housed no fish. The pond was empty, and it was unknown what purpose it would serve. Wei Bo would often squat down in front of the pond, and he could stare at it for one entire hour at a time. He even asked the little boy in azure and the little girl in pink to diligently look after this small pond for the next half a year, telling them not to let outsiders approach it. Perhaps Wei Bo didn't completely trust the two little children with this task, so he even asked the black python that now had a golden line on its belly to move out from its nest and keep guard near the bamboo building. After Chun Pingyan left Downtrodden Mountain, there was no one left for the little boy in azure to compare himself to. Spring was also settling in, causing the weather to gradually become warmer. Because of this, the little boy in azure slowly started to slack off. The little girl in pink reminded him about this 2 times, but the little boy in azure asserted that this was called maintaining an equilibrium and combining rest with cultivation. This was called accumulating his cultivation and suddenly soaring to great heights one day. This definitely wasn't a case of giving up and becoming lazy. Wei Bo came to the bamboo building again today, and the little boy in azure giddily followed behind him. No matter how much the little boy had questioned Wei Bo before, the mountain god would simply tell him to wait and see. Wei Bo was unwilling to reveal the truth to him. This caused the little boy in azure to feel extremely curious, and it was as if there were an unscratchable itch in his mind. In fact, he felt an urge to assume his true form and dive into the pond to make heads or tails of the situation. However, he was afraid of Wei Bo's position and power as well as this formal god's sinister habit of hiding blades behind his smiles. With this in mind, the water snake from the Imperial River forcefully suppressed his curiosity, lest his situation deteriorate while he was living under Wei Bo's influence. Just like always, Wei Bo squatted down in front of the small pond and carefully observed the delicate flow of the water. The water appeared still, yet this couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the root of Downtrodden Mountain's fortune didn't lie in the mountain god temple at the peak of the mountain. Instead, the root of the mountain fortune was at the bamboo building, while the root of the water fortune was in the small pond in front of him. Mountain god Song Yuzhong was already on bad terms with the formal god of the Great Li Empire's northern mountain, and he was also a loyal minister both during life and after death. Thus, loyal to the Great Li Empire's imperial Song clan as he was, he reported this secret information to the Ministry of Rites and the Ministry of Astronomy. However, he was simply told to remain tight-lipped and not to leak this secret. Since this was an order from the imperial court of the Great Li Empire, Song Yuzhong didn't try to pursue the matter any further. In terms of his cultivation base being restricted because of this, leaving him unable to exercise full control over Downtrodden Mountain, Song Yuzhong viewed this very lightly. However, it could be said that Song Yuzhong's relationship with his superior, Wei Bo, was becoming worse and worse. The little boy in azure also squatted down beside the small pond. In fact, he had no idea where the limpid water in the pond had been collected from. However, Since Weibo was the formal god of the Great Li Empire's northern mountain, he could naturally move mountains and transport water inside his territory with ease. The little boy in azure eagerly stared at the limpid water, feeling frustrated at the fact that he was unable to discover any clues or traces. He failed to notice that Weibo, who was squatting beside him, had a tense expression even though he was in his own territory. There were beads of sweat on his forehead, and it was as if there were a mountain weighing down on his shoulder. He couldn't stand up even if he wanted to. Time flowed like water, and the little boy in azure eventually yawned in boredom. Only at this moment did he notice the stranger standing beside Weibo. This person was standing with his back bent and his hands clasped behind his back, and there was a smile on his face as he looked at the small pond. He was dressed in Taoist robes, and there was a lotus flower hat on his head. He looked young and he appeared fairly handsome as well. However, his smile seemed a little improper. He looked like someone who would use the excuse of reading palm patterns for others to improperly touch the hands of young women. If this were in the past, and if they were near the Imperial River, then the little boy in azure's short temper would have definitely led him to confront the young Taoist priest and tell him to piss off as far away as possible. Now that he had experienced so many things in Dragon Spring Prefecture, however, he was much more reserved than before. However, he quickly remembered that he was standing next to the lofty formal god of the northern mountain, and there was also an utterly terrifying superior grandmaster at the pinnacle of martial arts in the bamboo building as well. That being the case, what did he need to be afraid of? The little boy in azure hurriedly stood up before clearing his throat and saying, "Oi, oi, oi! The Taoist priest over there. How can you be so disrespectful? How can you barge over without greeting us first? Do you know who my master, Xianxia, is? He's the owner of this entire mountain. Moreover, there's also an extremely aggressive black python staying near the bamboo building, and it absolutely loves to eat people. You should thank me that you're still alive because I'm the one who earnestly persuades it to give up meat every day. Otherwise, humph, humph." The little boy in azure crossed his arms and turned his nose to the air. He roared with laughter in his mind. "Wahahaha! I've been holding back for so long, and I've finally come across a mere mortal who I can scold. What a rare occasion." With this in mind, the little boy in azure became increasingly fond of the young Taoist priest. In fact, he felt an urge to become brothers with him. "Is that so? Then it's thanks to you that I was able to escape a calamity," the young Taoist priest said with a dazzling smile. He hurriedly thanked the little boy in azure. In the eyes of the little boy, this young Taoist priest's actions and demeanor were far more sincere than Weibo's cold and menacing smile that hid daggers behind it. However, the little boy in azure had been screwed over far too many times in this dog's-hit Dragon Spring Prefecture. Once bitten, twice shy, so the little boy couldn't help but feel like every person was potentially a supreme cultivator. As such, he carefully looked the young Taoist priest up and down again. After confirming that he didn't have the aura of a chi refiner, the little boy in azure felt so moved that he almost shed tears of joy. He swaggered over, and he jumped up to pat the young Taoist priest on the shoulder. "There's no need to thank me. Before leaving Downtrodden Mountain, Master Xianxia told me that I needed to assume responsibility when he was away. As the host, how can I allow you, my guest, to suffer from fright?" The barefoot old man saw this sight from the window on the second floor of the bamboo building, and he chuckled. "If you're so capable, why don't you pat the young Taoist priest on the shoulder again?" The little boy in azure immediately became alert. He looked up at the young Taoist priest, and he then glanced up at the crazy old man who was standing at the window on the second floor. Finally taking a glance at the lotus flower hat on the young Taoist priest's head, he asked in an uncertain voice, "Let's be open and honest with each other. Are you a 10th tier spiritual master from the Taoist sect? Or are you an 11th tier or 12th tier heavenly lord?" The young Taoist priest smiled and shook his head, replying, "I'm neither." The little boy in azure was slightly skeptical, and he said in a low voice, "My dear friend, as members of the cultivation world, we should all stick to the principle of sincerity when we deal with others, regardless of our seniority or cultivation base. You can't lie to me, okay?" The young Taoist priest nodded and said, "I'm genuinely telling the truth. Even if the little boy in azure couldn't defeat those under the 10th tier, wasn't there still Weibo and the crazy old man in Downtrodden Mountain? Thus, it would truly be pathetic if he still remained timid and cowardly." The little boy in azure rapidly considered these things in his mind, and he felt like he was already standing in a position of certain victory. A smile instantly spread across his face, and he jumped up and patted the young Taoist priest on the shoulder again. I can see that you're talented, so don't be disheartened. It's only the nascent tier of Taoism, so you still have some hope of reaching it as long as you work hard for a few hundred years. If you're truly unable to reach it and get picked on by others in the future, then just tell them my name and say that you're acquainted with the white water snake from the Imperial River or the little dragon king from Downtrodden Mountain. How do these two nicknames sound? One's carefree, while one's impressive. The barefoot old man roared with wanton laughter. He raised his thumb at the little boy in azure and remarked, I'm impressed, little water snake. If you don't die today, then you'll be able to brag about this for the rest of your life. The little boy in azure gulped upon hearing this. His eyes darted around, and he coughed before hanging his head and preparing to step back in retreat. Oh, it's time to cultivate. I definitely can't miss my cultivation session today. The young Taoist priest smiled and nodded, saying in a gentle voice, Yes, that's right. One definitely can't slack off when it comes to cultivation. Come on, let's go. I have some shallow knowledge about cultivation, so I can answer your questions and help you clear up your doubts. The little boy in Azure's vision suddenly became hazy. When things cleared up again, he suddenly discovered that there was someone standing beside him. This wasn't strange. However, what was strange was the fact that there was also someone squatting down beside Wei Bo. Not only that, but there was even someone standing opposite the crazy old man on the second floor of the bamboo building. In fact, there was also a person furtively glancing over while standing behind the silly girl who was secretly poking her head out from behind the bamboo building. All of these people were identical to the young Taoist priest with the lotus flower hat. The little boy in azure closed his eyes and pretended to be blind as he felt his way forward. I can't see anything at all. I'm walking around in a dream, just walking around in a dream. Standing behind the bamboo building, the little girl in pink blinked her large and watery eyes. Unlike the disrespectful little boy in azure, she was more curious than she was afraid. The young Taoist priest standing behind her had his hands tucked in his opposite sleeves. As he looked at the talismanic characters appearing on the bamboo wall, he clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, These characters are indeed as interesting as always, as expected of the person who helped. Haha! These divine secrets can't be revealed. Standing on the second floor of the bamboo building, the young Taoist priest leaned against the windowsill and asked with a smile, I've heard that you want to fight? The barefoot old man bowed in respect according to Confucian tradition, and he then paid his respects as a scholar from the Chui clan. After standing up straight, he took 2 steps back and clasped his hands in respect as a martial artist. He no longer appeared respectful or fearful, and there was fervor in his eyes as he said, Please enlighten me a little, Branch Master Lu. The young Taoist priest pretended to be relieved, and he laughed loudly and replied, Yes, that's no problem at all, as long as it's only a little. If you asked for a lot, then I would have truly been in a pinch. After all, I'm in majestic world, so it's as if my 2 legs are wading through mud. I can't walk too quickly, and I can't jump too high either. Next to the small pond, the young Taoist priest squatting beside Wei Bo asked, Great mountain god Wei, can you tell me about the origin of this water? Can you tell me about the origin of that golden lotus seed growing in the pond? Wei Bo was still unable to stand up, so he could only smile bitterly and reply, Branch Master Lu, this is 15,000 liters of spring water that I secretly ordered someone to collect before Divine Water Nation was destroyed. As for that golden lotus seed, it's an old antique from the Imperial Treasury of Divine Water Nation. Even the Imperial family and the Ministry of Astronomy were unable to explain the use of this lotus seed back then, and they simply treated it as a precious heirloom that they continued to pass down. While I was fleeing after the destruction of Divine Water Nation, I coincidentally came across this lotus seed in Go Table Mountain. After that, it became my possession. I'm wondering whether the spring water can nurture this golden lotus seed and allow it to bloom into that golden purple lotus that is rumored to only exist in the lotus flower world. Because Wei Bo was the formal god of the northern mountain, the owner of all of the mountain ranges in this region, his fate was thus directly linked to these mountains. However, this geographical advantage would sometimes transform into a natural catastrophe instead. It would become a huge burden for the formal god. When the young Taoist priest wearing the lotus flower hat appeared beside him, Wei Bo was immediately suppressed and no longer able to move. Even though the young Taoist priest was only stepping on Downtrodden Mountain, he was essentially stepping on the head of Wei Bo as well. If the young Taoist priest stomped on Downtrodden Mountain with his foot, then the gold statue of Wei Bo on the peak of Cloud Drape Mountain would immediately lose half an arm. The young Taoist priest shook his head and corrected, Golden purple lotus flowers aren't unique to the lotus flower world. There are 3 incredibly high-quality golden purple lotus flowers in the heavenly master residence of the Middle Earth divine continent's Mount Longhu. They're growing fairly well, and they're already more than 30 meters tall. Wei Bo was rendered speechless. The young Taoist priest was none other than Lu Chun, the 3rd disciple of the Tao ancestor whose Taoist sect was dominant in Heavenly World. The Taoist sect in Heavenly World was split into 3 teachings, and the branch masters of these teachings all enjoyed transcendent standings in the world. Their statuses were equivalent to Majestic World's etiquette sage, second sage, and scholarly sage. Lu Chun smacked the little boy in Azure's head and said with a faint smile, "Okay? Stop trying to play blind and dumb. If I truly wanted to harm you, do you really think this would help?" Even until now, the little boy in Azure was still in the dark about Lu Chen's true identity. However, judging by the young Taoist priest's mystical abilities, which he had used in front of Wei Bo and the crazy old man, no less, the little boy in Azure was well aware that he had come across a supremely powerful person. Moreover, it was extremely likely that this young Taoist priest was more powerful than anyone he had ever come across before. This clone of Lu Chun accompanied the little boy in Azure to the cliff and asked with a smile, "Have you heard the story of covering one's ear to steal the bell before?" The little boy in Azure wiped the sweat from his forehead and sniffled. "Yes. What did you think about it? Tell me the truth," Lu Chun said. The little boy in Azure sobbed and replied, "I simply found it amusing." "You're worthy of being taught," Lu Chun remarked in emotion. The little boy in Azure suddenly squatted down and wrapped his arms around the head. He dazedly looked into the distance, and he had a pitiful expression as if his life was empty and devoid of all meaning. He missed Qin Pinyin at this moment. If his master were present, then he would feel slightly more at ease even if his master's cultivation base was completely negligible. A rare expression of benevolence appeared on Lu Chen's face. He turned around and looked down at the dazed little boy, and he asked in a soft voice, "Little water snake, do you want to come to Heavenly World with me?" The little boy looked up, and his tear-stained face was scrunched into a frown. His bottom lip was downturned, and he replied in a pitiful voice, "If I say no, will you lift your foot and crush my head into pieces?" "Of course not." Lu Chun shook his head and said with a smile, "I'll simply confiscate this small pond. After all, both the spring water and the golden lotus seed can be considered things that I left in this world. By taking it away, I'm essentially taking a huge faded opportunity away from Qin Pinyin. Don't you always claim to be a hero and a brave person? After sponging off Qin Pinyin so much, are you not going to show some loyalty toward him? Are you not going to do a little something for him?" The little boy in Azure slowly shook his head. Tears clouded his vision, and he said, "Qin Pinyin won't blame me even if I'm disloyal 1 or 2 times. Lu Chun raised a hand to his forehead. He was also powerless against such a stupid little fool. So be it. The fate between them was yet to mature, so he would just leave things at this first. He sighed and told the little boy in Azure, "When you see Qin Pinyin, tell him that he owes me a favor regarding this small pond. He needs to return this favor in the future. As for you, you can head to the large waterway that runs through complete Reed continent from east to west when you're entering the river to become a flood dragon. If you can make it past half of the waterway, then that can be considered a success. When that time comes, you can ask Qin Pinyin to protect you and act as your guard. This is the favor that he needs to return to me." "Why are you treating me so well, immortal elder?" the little boy in Azure asked in hesitation. Lu Chun saw right through the little boy in Azure, and he huffed. "Firstly, I'm not your long-lost father or old ancestor. Secondly, I'm not interested in your flood dragon skin after you successfully transform into a flood dragon. Thirdly, I'm only providing you with guidance this one time because of your peculiar background. However, I might ask you if you want to come to Heavenly World with me again in the future." After saying this clone of Lu Chun vanished in a flash. The little boy in Azure stood up and looked around. He found that the young Taoist priest standing behind the silly girl and squatting beside Wei Bo had also vanished without a trace. A smile instantly broke through his tears, and he swaggered over to the little girl in pink who was standing behind the bamboo building. His voice was filled with arrogance as he announced, "Silly girl, do you know? The old immortal praised me for having immense talent, and he almost fell to his knees to beg me to become his disciple. He even said that he would bring me to some heavenly world or whatnot to live in luxury. But just who am I? Since I've acknowledged Qin Pinyin as my master, I naturally have to uphold the justice and righteousness of the cultivation world. Don't I? So, I rejected his offer without a shred of hesitation. Hey, you didn't see his expression back then. There were tears glistening in his eyes. Ah, what a pity. The old immortal was so sincere, but who can he blame for Chun Ping'an being so fortunate and taking me as a young scholarly attendant first? It's also my fault for being so loyal. Oh, that's right. Silly girl, what did the old immortal say to you? The little girl in pink raised a hand that was glowing with golden radiance, and she replied in an awkward voice. The old immortal discussed some calligraphy rules with me, and in the end, he said that you would definitely spew nonsense. So, he asked me to reward you with a slap in his stead. There was a crisp and sweet-sounding smack. The little boy in azure was brutally struck by the glowing golden palm, and he spun several times in the air before finally slamming into the ground. He remained lying there, and he decided to feign death. Wei Bo was filled with worry as he stood beside the small pond and gazed toward the second floor of the tranquil bamboo building. Inside a private residence called the Great Luxuriant Residence in Ancient Elm Nation, there was a tall and handsome scholar whose appearance was a little pale and sickly. He was eating a steamed peach flower mandarin fish at this moment, and there was a custom-made silver hook in his left hand and a pair of green bamboo chopsticks in his right hand. He slowly enjoyed his in-season meal, and even a pot of imperial-grade wine was beside his hand. From time to time, he would put his chopsticks down and grab this pot of wine to enjoy a sip. 4 of the most powerful martial arts grandmasters and chi refiners in Ancient Elm Nation were standing in front of the elegant scholar's meal table. They were all renowned cultivators. There was a sword grandmaster at the peak stage of the 4th tier of martial arts, a self-taught prodigy who had strong killing intent and was extremely bloodthirsty. Opinions about him were divided, and he received both praise and criticism from the cultivators in Ancient Elm Nation and the surrounding nations. It was widely acknowledged that he had many achievements but was immoral. His admirers staunchly believed that he could achieve certain victory against any sword cultivator at the lower 5 tiers, as long as they weren't a sword cultivator from a proper sect. Another was an assassin at the 4th tier, and he surprisingly didn't conceal his face. He was a rustic-looking man with an unremarkable appearance. On a closer look, though, it was clear that he was wearing a fake skin mask. He was the leader of Ancient Elm Nation's Case Purchasing Pagoda, an organization of assassins that was renowned throughout several nations. The name Case Purchasing Pagoda symbolized the fair price of their work, with the customers only needing to pay the price of a wooden case if they wanted to obtain a pearl in return. He had once accepted a request to assassinate a chi refiner at the middle 5 tiers, and he had only been a hair away from succeeding. If it hadn't been for a secret immortal treasure that his target had, it was very likely that he would have succeeded in his attempt. Afterward, the Case Purchasing Pagoda had suffered furious retribution and almost been forced to lie down low. However, the Case Purchasing Pagoda had also displayed its courageous and merciless side. Without caring about the consequences, it had especially targeted and killed disciples from that immortal clan traveling around the world to train. This was a long-lasting conflict that had continued for more than 20 years, leaving one side on the verge of destruction and the other side severely wounded. In the end, the conflict only ended after personal intervention and mediation from the imperial preceptor of Ancient Elm Nation. In the cultivation world, there were indeed people and forces who lived wretched lives and subjected themselves to the whims of others. However, there were also courageous and daring people and forces willing to spite themselves in order to drag immortals down from the mountains. Of the 2 other chi refiners, one was a bewitching woman who was an itinerant cultivator. She was skilled with poison and had an endless array of abilities that were incredibly difficult to defend against. No one was willing to provoke this scorpion lady, regardless if they were martial artists or immortals from the mountains. The final chi refiner was an unfamiliar face who had never shown himself in the imperial court of Ancient Elm Nation before. The reason why the young man who looked like a scholar preparing for an imperial examination was able to gather these 4 powerful cultivators together was that he was none other than the imperial preceptor of Ancient Elm Nation. After finishing the fragrant and succulent peach flower mandarin fish, the imperial preceptor retrieved 3 pieces of paper from his sleeve. Each piece of paper had the portrait of a person, and the imperial preceptor bent his finger and tapped on the portrait in the middle. This was the portrait of a young boy carrying a wooden case. He smiled and said, "There's a black-grade immortal treasure in the imperial treasury, and whoever succeeds in killing him will be able to obtain this treasure. However, let me say this first. It's extremely likely that this young boy is a 6th-tier sword cultivator, and his external appearance as a 3rd-tier pure martial artist is nothing more than a facade. Don't be fooled by this. I only care about receiving his head, and I couldn't care less about how you people go about killing him. As for the 2 other people, there will naturally be some rewards for killing them as well. You can rest assured about this. 3 of the 4 cultivators left, leaving only the Qi refiner who had never appeared before the imperial court of ancient Elm Nation before. Imperial Preceptor Chu, using the possessions of others to achieve your own goals isn't very good. Is it? He sneered. The young scholar smiled and asked, Is this your opinion? Or is this the emperor's opinion? The Qi refiner remained silent. The young scholar smiled and said, Won't everything be fine as long as you're the one to bring that person's head back? The treasure will still belong to the imperial treasury of the Chu clan, and it will simply take a detour through my hands. The Qi refiner humphed coldly before turning around to leave. After making a brief stop at Southern Stream Nation, the Kuan ship owned by Ceremony Mountain hovered into the sky and continued to travel south. The Kuan ship traveled above the middle and slightly southern region of eastern treasured Vile continent, and it was still flying in a leisurely manner through the clear blue skies. On this evening, the old scholar with the mink fur hat and missing tooth walked out of his standalone residence and arrived at the bow of the ship. His field of view was wide, and he gazed at the magnificent sight of the sun setting in the west. The old scholar stood there and watched the setting sun for a long time, and at some unknown time, a woman also taking a stroll around the ship walked over and stood beside him. She was a truly peculiar person, and was actually using the exquisite flying sword Lightning as her hairpin. The flying sword was famous throughout complete Reed continent. Thus, using it as a hairpin naturally demonstrated her lavishness and wealth. There was a pearl pendant hanging from the hilt of the flying sword, and the reason for this was even more peculiar. This was because the woman's father was afraid of Lightning being too quick, causing his daughter to be unable to control it. Thus, he had obtained this hornless dragon pearl from some secret realm in some dragon palace. Not only that, but he had even gone as far as to refine his sword again in order to bore a hole through this pearl. After attaching it to his daughter's flying sword, it could be used to reduce its speed. The old scholar didn't turn around to look at the young woman who had become enemies with him not long ago. There was a smile on his face, and his lips didn't move as he secretly transmitted a message using his mind. Little girl, you shouldn't have come here to see me. Be careful of exposing yourself. Otherwise, your father won't let you off lightly regardless of how much he dotes on you. The young woman had a cold expression, and she replied, Mr. Sword Urn, why are you doing this? You have no relatives, no friends, no descendants, and no disciples either. The old scholar rubbed his mink fur hat and no longer tried to conceal his voice. He smiled and directly said, Little girl, be honest with yourself and say it directly if you genuinely don't like young Master Hulu. There's no need to force yourself to like a man simply because he's a good person. If you come across a man whom you like in the future, there's no need to force yourself to dislike him simply because he's a bad person either. The young woman blushed slightly. The old scholar sighed with emotion and said, After experiencing a bumpy life where I've called the entire world my home, at the very end, it's surprisingly the small courtyard on this Kuan ship that calms my mind the most. Thankfully, I brought a case of books with me when boarding the ships. When I open my door each day, I'm able to see a sea of clouds as well as mountains and rivers and the sun and moon. How pleasing to the eye. After returning to my room and shutting my door, what greets me is a desk full of books and essays about morality, things I can use to cultivate my mind. The young woman sighed softly. It was her father who had organized this trip to the south for her, and he had said that she could use this trip to relax her mind. In the beginning, she had thought that her father was attempting to set her up with young Master Hulu. It was only after arriving at the Great Li Empire's Parasol Tree Mountain ferry station that she had realized that things were far more complicated than this. In fact, it was only yesterday when she had finally learned the entire truth. She discovered that Mr. Sword Urn was surprisingly the most critical go-piece on this Kuan ship. This was a very bold and consequential play. In fact, she almost felt like she was nothing more than a sacrificial go-piece as well. The old scholar with the mink fur hat waved his hand and said, Off you go. I'm not a handsome young man or anything, but you are indeed a young and unmarried woman. You might not feel awkward accompanying me to watch the sunset, but I can't help but feel a little uneasy. The young woman silently turned around and left. After returning to her courtyard, she halted her breathing and focused, quietly waiting for the drastic change to arrive. The old scholar from complete Reed continent who had the nickname of Sword Urn smacked his lips and took off his mink fur hat. After forcefully patting it 2 times, he casually tossed it overboard where it drifted away with the wind. See you later, old companion. The old scholar turned around to gaze toward the north. When he was young, he had once been a scholar in complete Reed continent who had possessed the talent to become a noble person. However, his temper had been bad, and he had also been arrogant and conceited. From morning to night, and from one year to the next, he had continued to scold other people. He had derided officials as useless fools, he had ridiculed generals as good-for-nothing gluttons, and he had accused the emperor of being a foolish and self-indulgent person. He had scolded everyone, but had he not been scolding himself as an utterly useless scholar as well? After both his clan and nation disappeared, the old scholar was no longer able to scold anyone. No longer wearing a mink fur hat, the old scholar walked back to his courtyard. The attendants and servants from Ceremony Mountain all greeted him with utmost respect when they saw him, and this caused the old man to feel a slight sense of guilt. However, he remained smiling as he greeted them back and joked around with them. He appeared extremely friendly, and he was far more adorable than the unsmiling young Master Hulu or the sinister and ruthless-looking Mistress Azure Bone. Night arrived, and the old man returned to his room and grabbed a Confucian classic. He then went to sit in the courtyard. He didn't read the book, and he simply closed his eyes and started to nap. The Kuan ship was flying over the territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire right now, a powerful empire with the highest number of sword cultivators in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. It was rumored that Wind Snow Temple's terrestrial sword immortal Wei Jian had stayed in this empire the longest when traveling around the world for the first time. He had engaged in several life-and-death battles during that time, and all of his opponents had been renowned sword cultivators in the luminous Vermilion Empire. The luminous Vermilion Empire was a top-notch empire in the south-central region of the Great Li Empire, and it had an impressive dozen or so vassal states. In terms of territory, it was second to only the Great Li Empire, which had conquered the Lu Empire. Moreover, among the old emperor's many sons, there were two who had given up their right to the throne and become ninth-tier sword cultivators. Of the 4 great guest elders of the imperial family, there was a 10th-tier sword cultivator who had fought 3 times with Wind Lightning Field's Li Tuanjing, someone who was regarded as the most powerful cultivator beneath the upper 5 tiers in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. He had lost all 3 times, yet the difference in power between him and Li Tuanjing had not been that significant. Otherwise, Li Tuanjing wouldn't have accepted his 2 subsequent challenges. Not long ago, the 2 powerful empires to the north of Lakeview Academy had fought to the death and had both become severely depleted. Not far to the south, the luminous Vermilion Empire had watched on without interfering. All of the officials in the imperial court had taken great pleasure in the misfortune of their 2 northern neighbors. There were numerous nations in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, yet only fewer than 10 of them could be regarded as legitimate empires. The Northern Lu Empire had already become history, and it was said that many members of the Imperial had committed suicide by hanging themselves or jumping into wells. In terms of those who remained alive, they had all been reduced to convicts or refugees who were forced to do hard labor for the Great Li Empire. Great Sui Nation was unable to challenge the Great Li Empire by itself. Traveling down south, 2 empires had fought each other to the death. In fact, the mortal enemies had even used up the last remaining treasures passed down by their ancestors. Both empires were severely depleted, and corpses lay strewn across their territories. Blood caked the land, and the location of their final battle was destined to become an ancient battlefield ruin that went down in history. To the north of Southern Stream Nation and Lakeview Academy, the northern region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent was raging with war. To the south, however, song and dance continued in peace. Yet, it was on this evening that tens of thousands of bursts of sword chi suddenly erupted from an unnamed mountain inside the territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire. The brilliant glow of the sword chi illuminated the land within dozens of kilometers, making it seem as if it were day. The bursts of sword chi soared into the sky like a waterfall flowing in reverse, and they accurately slammed into the Kuan ship that was passing overhead. The colossal intercontinental Kuan ship was instantly riddled with holes, and hundreds of people aboard the ship were killed in a flash. The severely wounded Kuan thrashed around violently as it wailed in agony. The numerous formations used to stabilize the structures on the Kuan's back were destroyed by the furious bursts of sword chi, so the violent thrashing of the Kuan naturally made matters even worse. Combined with the brutal winds sweeping through the skies, hundreds of people were directly thrown off the Kuan ship, plummeting to their deaths on the territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire. The destruction of the Kuan ship was already a foregone conclusion. Including the ship owner, all of the chi refiners from Ceremony Mountain were completely helpless against this situation. They could only stare on in helplessness as the dying Kuan dove toward the ground. During this time, Powerful cultivators continued to soar into the sky in panic. Mistress Azure Bone and her companions were among these people. The slender and extremely thin Mistress Azure Bone had a dark expression, and her eyes also became like sharp blades as she squinted. She held her son in one arm, and she held the neck of her husband with her other hand. She stared at the plummeting Kuan ship long and hard before shifting her gaze to the mountain where the bursts of sword chi had erupted from. It was as if she was searching for the culprit. Like small grains of rice, cultivators continued to soar into the air and distance themselves from the Kuan ship as quickly as they could. However, the chi refiners who were unable to fly had no option but to leave their fate to the heavens. Moreover, if the Kuan turned on its back when it landed on the ground, then it was without a doubt that all of them would be crushed to death. They would have no chance of survival. Right at this moment, an extremely long ray of golden light materialized in the sky to the north. The ray of golden light arrived beneath the head of the Kuan. This was surprisingly a middle-aged monk with an iron-willed expression. He held the Kuan with his hands, and with a furious roar, he bent his knees slightly and summoned a giant pool of golden lotuses beneath his feet. However, just how immense was the momentum of the plummeting Kuan ship? It was as if an entire mountain were crashing down from the sky. The monk was continually pushed down, and the golden lotuses beneath him were also obliterated one after another. Even though his appearance slowed the descent of Kuan a little, he would still be crushed more than 30 meters into the earth by the head of the Kuan if things continued as they were. Blood flowed from all 7 orifices on the middle-aged monk's face. However, his blood wasn't bright red, and it was instead golden yellow. He was surprisingly a golden arhat from the Buddhist sect. The monk showed no signs of giving up, and he unleashed an explosive bellow as he suddenly turned around to support the Kuan with his back. With his hands now free, he used them to form seals on his chest. The Buddhist monk raised his right forearm upright. His palm pointed outward, and his fingers pointed upward like 5 towering mountains. This was the Abhyamudra, the gesture of fearlessness of the Buddhist sect. Golden blood drenched the middle-aged monk, yet his expression remained calm and unfazed. It was as if he were completely indifferent and unfeeling toward his intense pain and the sacrifice of his hard-earned cultivation base. When the feet of the monk made contact with the ground, the Kuan ship's descent had already become slow and stable. However, the monk was still eventually pushed into the earth. When the Kuan ship finally rumbled to a stop, the monk was already nowhere to be seen. After a long while, the earth started to loosen, and a dust-covered monk covered in golden blood slowly dug himself out. He walked out from under the Kuan, and his face was filled with compassion and sympathy as he turned around and put his palms together. He lowered his head and said, "Amitba." Under the backdrop of night, the middle-aged monk walked across the back of the dead Kuan and weaved his way through the collapsed buildings and dead bodies. When he came across wounded individuals, he would do everything in his ability to look after them and provide them with help. In the end, he came across a young girl whose face was drenched in blood. The middle-aged monk sighed softly. Seeing that she was uninjured, he put his palms together and silently walked away. The eyes of the young girl were expressionless, and there was a young girl of the same age lying in her embrace. The face of the corpse was unclear, and there was a beautiful embroidered pouch hanging limply from her waist. The young girl who was still alive gently patted the back of the corpse and murmured over and over again, "Don't be scared, don't be scared." In Blusher Prefecture of Colorful Garment Nation, the sun was high and bright, and the streets and alleys of the prefectural city were bustling with people. Outside the city, the official roads were also flooded with merchants and travelers. The old immortal was staying in a large residence not far from the prefectural office. The owner of the residence was an extremely wealthy individual, and he sent invitations to many nobles in the city, both powerful nobles and relatively weak nobles. He invited them to his residence, and he especially constructed a tall stage for this occasion. Night was yet to arrive, yet his residence was already decorated with colorful lanterns. Guests arrived one after another, and many of them brought their family and children along. There were probably no fewer than 300 people. Thanks to their relationship with Lu Gaohua, the son of the prefectural overseer, Chun Ping'an and his companions were also able to attend this grand event. However, their seats were not anything special. They were seated on 2 long benches inside a corridor beside a lake. Even so, they at least had a small table filled with fruits and snacks. This was much better than some of the guests nearby, who only had seats but no tables or snacks. In fact, they had only received this table because Lu Gaohua had decided to sit with them instead of his father. Because of this, the host had decided to provide them with fruits and snacks as well. Chen Ping'an had initially wanted to practice standing meditation, but he was afraid that doing so would be far too eye-catching. Thus, he could only grab his wine gourd and slowly sip wine. Lu Gaohua was sitting between the big-bearded martial artist and Taoist priest Zhang Shanfeng, and he was quietly telling them about the impressive wealth of this clan, as well as their secret relationship with some great general in colorful garment nation. The old immortal and his yellow paper beauties arrived as scheduled, and he made his appearance by flying over from a tall building in the distance. He slowly descended onto the tall stage in the middle of the lake. When he landed, his large sleeves billowed slightly, as if he were a dragonfly gently coming into contact with the water. His immortal aura was displayed to the max, and his impressive entrance won thunderous applause and shouts of approval from the audience sitting around the lake. The old immortal's cheeks were rosy, and he appeared especially graceful and refined in his immortal robes. He didn't speak any nonsense after landing on the stage, and he didn't even make small talk with the prefectural overseer or the general of the prefectural city. Instead, he shook his wrist and summoned a yellow talisman between his fingers. If one were a cultivation grandmaster with good vision, then one would be able to make out the outline of a woman on this talisman. However, this outline was far from appearing detailed or lively. The old immortal gently snapped his fingers, causing the yellow talisman between his fingers to shoot forth and land on the ground. A plume of azure smoke slowly rose into the air. Immediately afterward, a graceful woman in colorful garb walked out from the azure smoke in an elegant manner. She then performed a curtsy toward the most esteemed guests sitting in a waterside pavilion. The big-bearded martial artist and the young Taoist priest clicked their tongues in wonder. Meanwhile, Lu Gaohua excitedly clapped his hands and roared in approval. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly shifted his gaze upward at this moment. Someone coincidentally looked over at the same time. This person was half-squatting on a distant courtyard wall, and he was flashing a wide grin at Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an calmly stood up and told Zhang Shanfeng that he was going to the toilet. The young Taoist priest nodded in acknowledgement and told him to come back quickly, lest he miss the spectacular show that was sure to follow. Chen Ping'an smiled and nodded in response. When Chen Ping'an left the corridor and walked down the steps, the young boy in black similar age to him also walked over along the courtyard wall. The distance between them continued to shrink. Chen Ping'an took a deep breath, and it was as if he were facing a formidable foe. There were some partings where reunions were not desired. Yet, it was often the case that reunions would inadvertently occur. For example, this reunion between Chen Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan. However, there were some partings where reunions were clearly desired, yet it was most often these partings that would never lead to reunions again. For example, the parting between Chen Ping'an and the young girl, Qiu Shi. Standing on the tall stage in the middle of the lake, the beautiful woman in colorful robes who had transformed from a yellow talisman paper looked around with her lively and attractive eyes. How could she be a lifeless puppet? She was clearly a living and breathing beauty. The old immortal was standing on the edge of the stage, and he retrieved a small pink porcelain bottle from his sleeve under the watchful gazes of everyone. Pulling the cork from the bottle, he casually tossed it toward the center of the stage. The bottle rolled to someplace near the feet of the beautiful woman in colorful robes, and after remaining silent for a moment, the sound of a guqin melodiously traveled out from the bottle. It was as if a guqin grandmaster were present on the stage and gracefully playing the instrument. If a guqin master were present, they would be able to discern the slow rhythm of the starting tune. Following the introduction of music, the beautiful woman in colorful robes slowly stretched her body, and her long sleeves looked like flowing iridescent clouds. The guqin paused momentarily, and the beautiful woman in colorful robes also stopped her movements. She maintained a playful posture with her legs crossed over each other. She stood lightly on her tiptoes in her pink embroidered shoes, as if her feet were young lotus buds revealing their tips. The rhythm of the guqin gradually picked up, and the graceful dance of the beautiful woman sped up as well. Her hips swayed like the gentle breeze, and a single backward glance from her would be filled with captivating charm. When the guqin became chaotic and forceful, it was as if a large handful of pearls were pitter-pattering onto a jade plate. The old immortal smiled faintly, and he suddenly lifted his two sleeves and caused 4 yellow paper talismans to float out from each sleeve. These paper talismans transformed into plumes of azure smoke when they hit the ground, hiding the beautiful woman from the view of the audience. They could only hear the rapid tune of the guqin, yet they couldn't see the figure of the beautiful woman in colorful robes. This caused them to become slightly anxious, yet it also caused them to become increasingly eager and excited. The notes of the guqin suddenly turned exuberant, like water splattering out of a fallen silver vase. 1. It was also at this instant that 8 beautiful young women in flowing white robes suddenly appeared amid the faintly discernible azure smoke. With the woman in colorful robes in the middle, the 8 ethereal-looking young women leaped outward with swords in their hands. At the same time, they gave a strange shout in unison, as if they were ancient tribe members performing a ritual to honor their god. However, this didn't ruin their elegant demeanor at all, and it instead gave off a valor no inferior to the bravest of men. Sitting in the waterside pavilion, the eyes of the middle-aged general responsible for the garrison near Blusher Prefecture immediately lit up. He was quite astonished by this performance. He had initially accepted the invitation and come here out of respect, but after seeing this magnificent sight, he couldn't help but applaud and sing praises of the performance. What a brilliant demonstration of heavy cavalry charging into battle! The young women leaping forward with swords in hand were especially brilliant in their ability to capture the fearsome aura of this scene. This is indeed a difficult and impressive achievement. Prefectural Overseer Lu stroked his beard and nodded with a smile, concurring, "It is indeed quite remarkable." The tune of the guqin soared through into the sky afterward, as if there were spring thunder rolling through the sea of clouds. The 8 sword-wielding young women in white robes continued to dance with the woman in colorful robes in the middle, and they spun around incredibly quickly and thrust their swords forward with agility and vigor. Meanwhile, the beautiful woman in colorful robes purposely slowed down, her movement now in stark contrast with the 8 young women in white. Moreover, there were many times when the young women in white leaned back and thrust their swords backward, with the tips of their swords stopping only an inch or so from the woman in colorful robes. Their movements were extremely risky, yet the beautiful woman in colorful robes remained smiling like a dazzling flower the entire time. The scene on the tall stage in the middle of the lake had the beauty of flowing clouds and rippling water, and it also had a charm that was both heart-stopping and soul-stirring. The old immortal smiled faintly and said in a soft voice, "Come back!" The graceful movements of the beautiful women on the stage were extremely quick, and blades of snow-white sword light continued to sweep toward the surroundings. This sword light would illuminate the faces of some guests from time to time, and many of them would be so scared that they would immediately cover their faces with their hands. It was also at this moment that the old immortal issued his command. The 8 young women in white suddenly stopped their movements and transformed back into pieces of yellow paper talismans. They hovered in the air, and when the old immortal waved his hand, they immediately flew into his sleeves like swallows returning to their nest. The beautiful woman in colorful robes bent down and retrieved the pink porcelain bottle before gracefully walking over to the old immortal and handing it back to him. She then flashed a beautiful smile toward the waterside pavilion, and only after that did she transform into a roughly drawn yellow paper talisman like the 8 young women in white. The old immortal carefully placed the talisman inside his sleeve. This skillful performance by the old immortal from afar astonished everyone sitting around the lake. All of the wealthy people who had traveled over from all over Blusher Prefecture were stunned by this performance, and some local, esteemed immortals, who had initially wanted to challenge the old immortal no longer had the face or confidence to jeer and boo. Feng leaned forward to get around the son of the prefectural overseer sitting between him and Xianxia, and he asked in a soft voice, "Big Brother Su, were you able to determine their true identities? Are they ghosts or demons? In any case, my demon-detecting bell didn't ring at all." The big-bearded martial artist ignored the young Taoist priest's question, and he rubbed his chin and mumbled. In terms of their figures, the young woman in white who had a mole next to her mouth was no inferior to the woman in colorful robes. Lu Gaohua was still filled with astonishment, and he murmured to himself, "Such incredible mystical abilities. No wonder the notes written in the books always express people's desires to enter the mountains to visit immortals. If I can learn this mystical ability, then will I still need to visit brothels and drink flower wine in the future?" The big-bearded martial artist finally came to his senses, and he asked Zhang Shanfeng, "Chun Ping'an still isn't back yet? He didn't fall into the toilet, did he? Chun Ping'an isn't interested in these things, so maybe he secretly ran away to practice his fist stances." The young Taoist priest replied in exasperation. Xianxia nodded in wholehearted agreement. Chun Ping'an is definitely able to do such things to spoil the fun. In fact, we can ask young Master Lu to take us to those lovey-dovey places afterward. After experiencing those things, I guarantee that Chun Ping'an will feel a strong urge to squat right next to the stage in the middle of the lake the next time there's a performance. There was a troubled expression on Lu Gaohua's face, and he said, "Chivalrous Su, I'm so poor that there's nary a decoration in my house. You guys have seen the state of my residence as well. I did occasionally visit those places in the past, but that was because I was dragged over by my friends. To put things bluntly, the girls were initially willing to flatter me and actively serve me because I'm the son of the prefectural overseer. After a while, however, they all started to deride me as a stingy cheapskate behind my back. They're stopping just short of showing an attitude to my face. As the son of a powerful official, you've actually managed to reduce yourself to such a state? That's quite impressive of you, Lu Gaohua, the big-bearded martial artist teased. What? You haven't had any success with your studies, and you're unable to inherit your father's position, but you're unwilling to give up some face to accumulate wealth another way. So, in the end, you choose neither option and just aimlessly seek entertainment every day. A look of dejection appeared on Lu Gaohua's face, and he said in self-ridicule, "If I weren't the only son in the family, and if my father weren't hoping for me to continue our bloodline, then he would have at most written a eulogy for me if I had died in that ancient residence. His eulogy would definitely be filled with tears and emotions, and it would definitely become famous among scholars and literati. In reality, however, the relationship between us is only SOSO. So Xianxia peeled a mandarin and offered half of it to Lu Gaohua. He didn't say anything to console the prefectural overseer's son. It was because the young man was living a peaceful life where he didn't need to worry about food or shelter that he felt like everything was a struggle. When true hardship struck, however, he would quickly realize that this kind of struggle was, in fact, no struggle at all. Zhang Shanfeng was slightly worried about Qin Pinyin, and he was just about to stand up and head off to look for him. However, the corridor was already flooded with people and impossible to navigate through, so he had no option but to give up. After arriving at a quiet location, Qin Pinyin stopped 7 or 8 steps away from the exterior wall of the residence. The young boy in black remained squatting on the wall with an amused look in his eyes. He looked Qin Pinyin up and down, and he said in the dialect of Dragon Spring Prefecture, "During our battle by the stream back then, I was unable to discern the power of your fists. Looking back at it now, I was indeed careless when I fought you in the immortal tomb. My loss wasn't completely unwarranted. To hear one's native tongue in a foreign land." However, Qin Pinyin didn't feel happy at all. This young boy in black was none other than Apricot Blossom Alley's Ma Kuxuan. Back then, he had been taken as a disciple by True Martial Mountain, one of the Militarian ancestral forces in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. During their battle in the immortal tomb, Ma Kuxuan had purposely held back and accumulated his power with the goal of killing both him and Ningyao in a single breath. However, it was because of this that Qin Pinyin had found the opportunity to almost kill him using the skirt dagger that he had borrowed from Ningyao. Yet, it was at that critical moment that the powerful cultivator from True Martial Mountain had stepped forward to block his attack. As a result, Qin Pinyin had failed to kill Ma Kuxuan. There was a handful of brine soybeans in Ma Kuxuan's hand. He tossed them into his mouth one after another and enjoyed them with relish. While cultivating in True Martial Mountain, he had initially been worried that this young boy from Clay Vase Alley would have died already or become nothing more than a measly mortal. If that were the case, then it would feel extremely unfulfilling when he finally managed to exact revenge. During the past year or so, Ma Kuxuan had entered True Martial Mountain to train with his second master. He had made a huge name for himself during this time, and it could be said that he had become famous throughout dozens of nations around True Martial Mountain. Who in these nations didn't know about this one-in-a-century prodigy from True Martial Mountain? Which Militarian elder or ancestor dared to shoot a sideways glance at him simply because of their seniority or power? Facing no obstructions whatsoever, he had advanced 3 tiers in just one short year. Right now, he was already at the peak stage of the 5th tier, the furnace molding tier. This was absolutely terrifying. Ma Kuxuan had engaged in no fewer than 16 battles against opponents of the same cultivation on True Martial Mountain, and he had achieved victory in each and every one. However, it was a shame that his trip to the outside world this time could only be regarded as freely exacting revenge and repaying debts of gratitude based on his whims. He was still unable to break through the barrier of the 5th tier and advance to the middle 5 tiers. Thus, Ma Kuxuan was in a fairly bad mood. He had told his master to return to True Martial Mountain first, and he had said that he wanted to wander around the outside world to relax his mind. He wanted to look for some grandmasters at the 3 chi tempering tiers to practice his techniques, and he wanted to see whether these battles could help him shatter his barrier and advance to the next tier. However, even without using the many immortal treasures that he had obtained as rewards, gifts, or wagers, Ma Kuxuan had still been unable to find a genuine martial arts grandmaster after traveling through half a dozen small nations. Most of them had been martial artists at the 4th tier or 5th tier fishing for fame, and none of them had been able to withstand more than a few punches from him. Ma Kuxuan continued to snack on his brine soybeans as he chuckled. Chen Pingyan, by the looks of it, you've set your mind on becoming a pure martial artist? In fact, this doesn't matter too much. If you're lucky, the Great Li Empire might become interested in you once you become a 6th tier martial artist. At that time, you can choose to become a general with a bit of power and influence, and that can be considered bringing glory and honor to your ancestors. Chen Pingyan paid no heed to this, and he directly asked, "Are you here to look for me? Or are you simply passing by?" Ma Kuxuan broke into laughter, and it was as if he had heard the most hilarious joke in the world. He finally stopped laughing after much difficulty, and he tossed the remaining brined soybeans into his mouth before sneering. "I'm merely passing by. You truly overestimate yourself, Chen Pingyan. As for why I'm here, it's because I heard about a peerless sword god who's entered seclusion in Colorful Garment Nation for more than 30 years. Everyone praised his sword techniques as divine and godly, and they claimed that he was even more powerful than the immortals from the mountains. They lavished him with praise, saying that his sword rested not in his hands but in his heart and whatnot. I found him after much difficulty, yet he was unwilling to accept my challenge and said that he had already exited the cultivation world. I was furious when I heard this. I spent more than half a month looking for him, so how could he shoo me away just like that? However, no matter how I attacked him, he would simply dodge my attacks and refuse to engage in battle. He continued to run away just like that. Even if I caught up to him and smashed him to death with a single punch, that would have gone against my initial goal of looking for others to spar with. So, I came up with a plan and went out to look for his descendants. After killing 2 of them, I took their heads with me and went to look for the sword god again. He finally agreed to fight with me. However, he was only a sword-wielding martial artist at the 5th tier, so how could he live up to his title of sword god? What do you say, Chen Pingyan? In reality, Ma Kuxuan was someone of few words in true martial mountain. He definitely wasn't someone who would go on and on without rest. Apart from experiencing occasional enlightenment, advancing to the next tier, or heading out to find others to fight or kill, he would spend most of his time cultivating in seclusion. Apart from his teacher in name, there were 2 other old ancestors from true martial mountain who would train with him and teach him the true intent of militarians. One was arranged by true martial mountain, and one had volunteered due to their interest in Ma Kuxuan. In fact, the latter viewed Ma Kuxuan as their successor. Even Ma Kuxuan was unsure of why he felt like saying so much to Chen Pingyan. Of course, there were still more important things to do after saying all of this. For example, having another fight.